Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into part 2 of What If Deku Was Trained by Mirko? A special shout out to the original creator, resistantborg. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku aimed his weapon carefully, keeping his eye on the target in front of him as everything else faded into the distance. Silence surrounded him as he weighed the gun in his hand, gauging the perfect moment to pull the trigger. He pressed down, releasing the pressure building up inside himself as the bullet hit the bullseye. He repeated this process over and over again, getting perfect shots each time as he honed his instincts on the course. Snipe's private shooting range had become his safe space, a place for him to escape from his mind and the outside world for a bit. Shooting allowed him to focus on a single goal, allowing him to subvert the constant buzzing of his mind for a few hours each weekend. He finished off the rest of the targets with ease before he carefully put the gun back in its locked case and removed his protective gear. When he turned around, he was greeted by Snipe, who was smiling proudly at the downed targets. The man usually hung close by when Izuku was on the range, but allowed the boy to do his thing as long as he was being safe. They may seem like an unlikely pair at first, but the two had bonded quickly over their practice sessions and shared meals. Isamu had become a stable force in his life, constantly reminding him of Uncle Shota. "You did a great job, sharpshooter." Isamu ruffled his hair as he approached, a sign of affection that Izuku had learned to accept from the taller individuals in his family. "I learned from the best." Izuku smiled up at the hero, enjoying his last few moments of peace before he had to step back into the real world for the day. "I don't know about that." Snipe smiled shyly. "Do you have any more thoughts on incorporating guns into your hero work?" Izuku hesitated. He had been thinking more on the subject, especially now that he had really honed his skills and seemed to have a talent for the weapon. Guns were a powerful and useful tool, but they could also cause more harm than good. One of his notebooks was filled with the pros and cons of using the weapon when he began training at UA, and he finally felt ready to answer the question his mentor had begun asking him every few weeks. "I think I will incorporate guns, but not in the traditional sense." Izuku thought over his next words, wanting to frame his explanation in a way that didn't demonize Isamu's daily work but still conveyed Izuku's point of view. "I think traditional guns can be a useful tool, but I want to utilize them in a different way. Nedzu and I have been brainstorming new types of ammunition that can help me in the field. So far we have electric darts, fire extinguishing capsules, and pods that expand into nets." Izuku knew he didn't want to wield the deadlier version of the weapon, but he could still use his hard-earned skills for good. Snipe simply smiled at him for a few moments, his eyes shining with pride and respect. "You really do have the heart of a hero, kiddo." The praise made Izuku blush in embarrassment and shuffle his feet awkwardly. No matter how many times he heard it or how many heroes told him, he still had trouble believing in himself most of the time. He could always count on his family to encourage him and build his confidence. They finished putting away everything they used that day, always leaving the range in perfect condition. Isamu had instilled an appreciation for order and pride in your space, and this carried over into everything Izuku did in his daily life. Izuku liked to think of himself as organized chaos nowadays. As they walked to Snipe's car after locking up the building, Izuku asked if he would be coming over for dinner. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, you know that." Isamu ruffled his hair one more time before they both stepped into his truck and strapped themselves in for the ride home. It was Saturday, so that meant Izuku had shooting practice in the morning and lessons with Nedzu in a few hours. His schedule was always packed, but he liked it that way. His mentors and mom had created a set schedule for him, helping him to keep on top of his academics while still being able to train. Izuku's training schedule. Friday. Training with Uncle Sho with Hitoshi, Tenya, and Dabi. Tuesday/Thursday. Alternate training with Rumi/Keigo with Hitoshi, Tenya, and Dabi. Saturday. Gun training in the AM and lesson with Nedzu in the afternoon. Sunday. Meet with Namuri and Emi plus rest day. He had assignments from Nedzu throughout the week, and Tensei and Genist would take him twice a month for their own training sessions when they could. If any of his mentors got stuck with a mission or paperwork, he would spend his time in UA's support department with Higuri and Mei. It might seem like too much, but spending time with his family was his favorite escape from the realities of his day-to-day life. The taunts of his classmates disappeared when he was surrounded by so much love and support, at least most of the time. He still got stuck in his own head, even with the work he was doing with Emi and Nimuri. He just had to take it one day at a time, always striving to be better and to become the hero he had always dreamed of being. Mei had begun joining him during his lessons with Nedzu, although Uncle Sho had argued against putting the two chaos gremlins together with the rat god. Thankfully, Izuku's lovely mother thought it was a great way for the two to expand their minds, and she had brushed away the rest of the hero's concerns. There had only been one small fire at UA since Mei started, so clearly they had no reason to worry. Now that she was officially adopted and free from her parents, the girl had begun to shine. Her prowess for invention constantly impressed Izuku and their mentors, as she had already created multiple support items that the heroes had incorporated into their daily use. He would never understand how her parents had given her up so easily, and he couldn't imagine not having her in his life. Nedzu and his mother had made quick work of the legal system, ensuring her parents' employer knew what they had done before they were sent back to Japan for punishment. The couple was currently waiting for their sentencing, but Izuku expected that they would be spending a long time in jail. When multiple pro-heroes and the principal of UA condemned someone for child abandonment, the judicial system usually took notice. Mei seemed to be adjusting just fine, but Higuri still made sure she attended weekly therapy sessions to help her work through any lingering trauma and to help her adjust in her new home. They pulled up to the Midoriya home and Izuku waved goodbye to Snipe before heading inside, ready to relax for a few hours before he had to go to UA. "You asshole! I'm going to kill you!" Rumi exclaimed as he walked further into the house, and he paused for a moment to make sure there wasn't a threat of any serious violence. He found Dabi, Keigo, and Rumi sprawled across the various couches and playing Mario Kart. Princess Peach was currently on the screen celebrating a victory, and Izuku quickly understood what had angered his older sister. Before Rumi could make good on her threat, she noticed Izuku standing behind them. "Suku, want to join us?" she asked as she threw a piece of popcorn at Keigo's head. The blonde glared at her but held off on retaliating due to Dabi sitting right in the line of fire between the pair. His mother had banned most competitive games from being played inside the house, but she was at the office finishing up a few things for one of her cases. He would have to be the responsible one in this scenario, preventing his older siblings from destroying anything too important. It'd also be fun to run Keigo off the Rainbow Road a few times. "Yeah, I'm just going to shower and change and then I'll be back down." He left his siblings to their play fighting and made his way to his room, ready to take a hot shower to soothe his aching arms and shoulders. The burn after a good early morning training session was his favorite feeling, a sign of his hard work and the progress he had made. The warm water washed over him, allowing him to lose himself in his thoughts as he washed away the grime from the day. When he was finished, he changed into a pair of basketball shorts and a t-shirt, wanting to stay comfortable while he was at home. Mike and Genist had helped him find his own personal style, something he liked to play around with when he was out and about with his friends or family. He was careful to wear a face mask and hat when he was in public with the heroes, not wanting his connection to them to be made public just yet. If his connection to the heroes was made public, he knew people would question his potential acceptance to UA no matter how hard he worked. While his style usually consisted of fashionable graphic t-shirts and his trusty leather jacket, he enjoyed dressing down when he was at home. When he was finished getting ready, he ran down the stairs with a wide smile on his face, ready to bother his older brother. He launched himself over the back of the couch where Dabi sat, landing in the man's lap and sprawling out like a cat. The man grunted at the weight, his long green hair falling into his face from the force of Izuku's landing. Dabi had grown his hair out during his hero training, not wanting to bother with getting it cut every 2 weeks while he was trying to become a pro. His permanently dyed hair was thin and straight, so unlike the thick curls that sat on top of Izuku's head. People easily accepted that Dabi was Izuku's cousin-turned-adopted brother when they went out with their mom, and Izuku sometimes forgot that it wasn't the truth. He loved his brother dearly, but he also enjoyed terrorizing him whenever he could. There are so many open seats, yet you chose the only one I'm sitting in. Dabi grumbled, but he didn't move Izuku from where he was laying over his lap. What can I say, I missed my big brother. Izuku cackled as Dabi tried to push him off, but he made his way to an empty seat as Rumi tossed him a controller. I guess we're chopped meat, Keigo? She joked, rolling her eyes at the antics of the two Midoriya boys. I don't know, Dabi's lap is probably comfortable. Keigo said absent-mindedly as he scrolled through the various tracks. Everyone got quiet, waiting for him to realize what he just said. A dark red blush slowly spread its way up his neck as his eyes widened in realization. Dabi was completely frozen as he stared ahead at the screen, his expression resembling a robot that needed to reboot before functioning. Izuku debated on telling the two pining idiots in front of him to get a room, but he chose to be merciful and distract from Keigo's blunder. I wonder which track you guys will choose. Not like it matters, we all know I'm going to get first place. Rumi caught on to what he was trying to do, and she started to heckle them all by claiming that she would be the Mario Kart champion. Keigo and Dabi both relaxed a bit, clearly thankful that the other two occupants of the room decided to ignore the awkward moment from before. They played multiple rounds, taking turns choosing the course and changing their characters every few turns. Izuku came out on top almost every time, much to the chagrin of the three heroes. Rumi was able to beat him twice, a fact she held over the heads of Keigo and Dabi the entire time. Izuku caught both men looking at each other when they thought the other wasn't watching, and he couldn't help but roll his eyes. Hopefully Keigo's accidental admission from earlier would help speed things along between the two of them. He already had to deal with the strange dynamic between his mom and Isamu. He didn't want to deal with watching these two idiots pine over each other as well. Rumi had gotten up to grab a snack, and when she returned she vaulted herself over the couch and landed on Keigo as she casually chewed on her carrots. She winked at Izuku, clearly acknowledging that she had noticed the secretive glances between the two men as well. Really, Rumi? Why are you and Izuku such gremlins? Keigo pouted, rubbing his side as Rumi made her way back to her seat. Because you two are so easy to terrorize, she said, fist-bumping Izuku as she passed by. They played a few more rounds of Mario Kart until it was time for Izuku to get ready to head to UA. Mei, right on cue, used her key to enter the house and fetch her inventing partner. What are you all up to? She asked as she entered the living room, watching as Izuku won the final race of their tournament. The three adults all groaned and complained as Izuku casually tossed the controller on the couch and got up to greet his friend. Nothing much, just teaching them how to play Mario Kart. Izuku dodged the carrot that was thrown at his head as Mei cackled at his joke. Clearly they need a few more lessons. She quipped before Izuku pulled them both up the stairs and into the safety of his room. No one would risk taking it too far while in Midoriya Inko's home, so he knew that none of the young adults in the living room would follow them upstairs. I'm going to change and then we can make our escape. He grabbed a few things from his closet and made his way to the bathroom while Mei began tinkering with something she pulled from her bag. His outfit for the day was a simple pair of black jeans paired with a Ms. Joke t-shirt, a plain black tee with her signature yellow smiley face on the top right breast pocket. When he was finished changing, he grabbed his leather jacket off the back of his desk chair, motioning for Mei to follow him. He let out a sigh of relief when he saw his older siblings had vacated the living room, and he hoped they would forget his joking by the time dinner rolled around. Keigo had the attention span of a bird, but Dabi and Rumi could hold a grudge for a surprisingly long time. He grabbed a pair of yellow sneakers, in the same style as the red pair he loved so much as a kid. He knew they would probably be working in the support studio, but he'd change into his overalls and steel-toed boots when they got to the school. Mei chose to wear her work gear constantly, always ready to jump in and get to work wherever she could. She was trailing next to him as they began the trek to UA, still tinkering with the invention in her hands. Izuku was curious about the device, but he knew she would tell him about it when she was ready. They only had to walk a few blocks to UA's campus, and Izuku was once again thankful that he lived so close. On days where he didn't have to train, he was able to use the facilities, as long as he was supervised by an adult. He also loved to visit Nedzu when he had free time for tea and chess, another way for him to spend time away from home and use his mind outside of training. As they were approaching the gates, Mei finally looked up, holding out her gadget towards Izuku expectantly. He took the device wordlessly, looking it over as he awaited her explanation. They had fallen into such an easy pattern with each other, so he knew she was just gathering her thoughts before launching into a description of the device. Power Loader and Nedzu had been helping Mei work on her pitches, helping her organize her thoughts and give concise descriptions of her inventions. She was working hard to make her inventions marketable, but Izuku still loved to sit and listen when she was too excited to speak slowly or clearly. Her excitement was one of the things he admired the most about her, and he hoped that she wouldn't lose it as she worked to be more professional. It's a mask insert that would allow heroes to breathe underwater for as long as they want. She began, before pouring into the science behind the device and different ways to incorporate it into hero suits. Izuku smiled widely, already thinking of the lives that would be saved during floods and tsunamis. There were many heroes that operated on the sea that did not have aquatic quirks, and this device could be the difference between life and death for both heroes and civilians alike. They continued discussing the invention and any final touches they should make before presenting it to Nedzu as they walked onto campus. Their faces were added to the system, making it easier for them to come and go as they pleased. The pair walked through the winding halls of UA to Nedzu's office, ready to find out what they were assigned for the day. They would probably be able to finish the electric whips they had been working on, unless Nedzu had a random side project he wanted them to finish first. "Hello, children." Nedzu welcomed them as they entered the office, waving at the steaming cups of tea already prepared for them. They sat at his desk for a bit, catching up and discussing their latest assignments and readings before going over their itinerary for the day. "You are more than welcome to work on your whips in the support department, unless you'd like to work on something else." Their mentor always liked to give them options, never constraining them to one activity or topic unless they wanted to be. Izuku and Mei locked eyes, nodding at each other in agreement without even saying a word. "We'd like to work on the whips," they said at the same time, much to the amusement of their mentor. "Well, it's settled then." Nedzu clapped his hands together before scurrying onto the floor. Off to the support department. On their way to the support labs, Nedzu explained that Power Loader was still at his agency, so the principal would be supervising them during their tinkering. Izuku was looking forward to getting his mentor's opinion on their newest collaboration, especially since it would be used in the field by multiple members of the family. The labs had become a second home to them, a place where they could escape for a few hours and create whatever their minds could come up with. Mei spent all of her free time here, and Izuku tried to join her when he could. She attended classes at Sumai with Hitoshi and Tenya, a fact that Izuku tried to forget each time they hung out as a group. He was still stubbornly holding onto Aldera. He needed to prove to himself that he was strong enough to get through the discrimination he'd face as a hero in training and probably as a pro. His family stopped pressing him to leave the school, finally giving up after he asked them to stop pestering him about it. Hitoshi was the sole outlier, still begging Izuku to get the school shut down and the teachers punished for ignoring the bullying. Izuku and Hitoshi related to each other when it came to social ostracization and bullying, but his friend at least had a quirk. Being viewed as inherently evil was better than being viewed as broken. Izuku and Mei made their way to their personal work table, an area Higuri had set aside for them. This part of the support department was off limits to everyone else, as many of the projects they were currently working on were more advanced than the things even the third years were doing. Mei entered her personal code and used the retina scanner to gain access to their storage locker, pulling out the whips and the various tools they might need for the day. Izuku was giddy at the thought of finishing this project, especially knowing how excited Auntie Nomuri was about her new whip. The woman had done so much for him, he wanted to find a way to repay her. They immediately went to work, putting parts together seamlessly as Nedzu watched from the table next to them. The principal had his infamous pot of tea with him, and he enjoyed a cup of it as he watched them work with a small smile on his face. Many assumed the hero would hate humanity, with all he had been through. The truth was, he actually found them absolutely wonderful and fascinating. He was especially happy when he met humans that could keep up with his intellect, like the two children debating the safest maximum electrical output for their invention. Izuku appreciated Power Loader and Nedzu because they let them solve their problems on their own, only giving hints when they asked questions. This encouraged them to hone their problem-solving skills and figure things out by themselves, making them more independent and quick on their feet during a crisis. After a few hours they had done everything they could to make the whips functional. Now they were ready for the testing stage. Mei cheered their success, but Izuku kept staring at the various weapons in front of him. There was something missing, but he couldn't place what it was. He suddenly remembered his conversation with Mei from earlier about her newest water-safe invention. We should make them waterproof. He blurted out as he tried to sort through the hundreds of ideas pouring through his head. These could be the perfect support item to counteract villains with water quirks, and the applications only multiplied from there. Mei was staring at him with wide eyes and an open jaw, which quickly formed into a feral grin. Izuku, you're a genius. She leaped over to his side of the table as she pulled up the schematics for the whips. I truly enjoy watching how your minds work together. Nedzu chuckled as he watched the two young inventors brainstorm different materials that could serve as an outer barrier. After half an hour of searching, Izuku hit the jackpot. I found it. He called as he brought his laptop over to Mei to review his findings. The material was used to seal the uniforms of aquatic heroes, making them resilient against both water and weather. Izuku didn't have contacts with any water-based heroes, but there was one other agency that used the barrier for their hero suits. The metallic suits worn by the Ida family were not rust-proof, an expensive problem that led to constant repairs and replacements until they began layering their uniforms with a water-resistant barrier. It was exactly what they needed to put the finishing touches on their latest invention, and Izuku knew he could convince Tensei to ask his parents to lend them some. He and Mei typed up a professional email to Tensei and the head support engineer at the Ingenium agency to ask for a small amount of the barrier. Nedzu approved the email, only making a few minor changes before telling them to send it. There was nothing else to do but wait, so they decided to call it a day. They put everything back in its place, carefully locking everything up and ensuring that their workspace was tidy. There were rules in place to make sure they respected the workshop, and they'd lose privileges for a week if they left things messy or disorganized. My dad is back home, so I'll probably spend some time with him before we come over for dinner. Later, Mei informed him as they left the campus for the day. She had to take a different route to get to her home, so they parted ways with the promise that they'd see each other that evening for their family meal. Izuku couldn't help but smile, feeling satisfied with the progress he made in both his training and his inventing that day. It felt like his goals were getting more and more realistic as the time passed by. When he was a kid, before he met Rumi, becoming a hero felt like an unreachable goal. Now it was attainable as long as he kept focusing on his training. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice, and ice slivered through his veins as he froze in the middle of the sidewalk. "Fuck off, man," one of his main tormentors shouted as he playfully shoved another classmate on the sidewalk in front of him. They hadn't seen him yet, thankfully, but he was running out of time to escape without being noticed. He darted into the alley to his left, using the fire escapes to quickly climb onto the roof to watch as his classmates disappeared down the street. His heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through him as he willed himself to calm down. Fear was quickly replaced by rage and frustration as he thought over his reaction to seeing two of his bullies out in public. He acted like such a coward, running away and hiding even though he had every right to be out in public. Why did he have to live dual lives, one as a future hero and one as the school punching bag? He sparred with pro-heroes, yet the sight of his classmates caused him to cower in fear and run into a random alleyway? The worst part was that he could take his peers down without even breaking a sweat. But he refused to use his training for hurting people, he'd much rather use it for saving. He couldn't let himself stoop to the level of those that tormented him, he'd rise above and prove that he had the heart of a hero. He tried to push away the anger still pooling in his gut, but it continued to grow despite his best efforts. How dare kids like that call themselves future heroes, yet they spent their days torturing someone that they deemed lesser than. His vision began to blur as he clenched his fists, only stopping when his nails began to draw blood from his palm. He held his hands in front of him, staring at the tiny rivulets of red that were now running down his wrists. The sight scared him, as though the universe was showing him what his suppressed rage was capable of if he just let it out. What if he was allowed to be unapologetically angry, like Bakugu? How much could he get away with? His phone began to ring, and he answered without looking at the caller ID. Izuku? Are you on your way home? His mother's worried voice carried over the speakers, immediately soothing him and distracting him from his earlier thoughts. Yeah, I am sorry to worry you. He apologized, not wanting to add to his mother's pile of stressors. He realized he had been standing on the roof for over 30 minutes, stuck in his head as he processed his anger and embarrassment. After he used the fire escape to quickly reach the street once again, he began to make his way back home. The negative emotions that had plagued him earlier were slowly dissipating, but he still felt on edge as he approached his street. His mom and the rest of the family would immediately see through his facade if he didn't try to calm down and get out of his head. When he walked in the house, he found it mostly empty, and when he checked his phone, he realized he had missed a text from his mom saying that she was headed to the store to pick a few last-minute things up. He began to ascend the stairs to his room, but noticed Keigo and Dabi on the back porch. His curiosity was piqued, especially when he saw Keigo's feathers standing straight up and the blush covering the spaces between the light pink burns on Dabi's face. He used his stealth training to ascend the stairs without being noticed, making his way towards his window and opening it just enough to hear what was happening down below. He had never been more grateful that his room was positioned to face the backyard. Izuku settled in, ready to snoop in on the men's conversation. So, what did you want to talk about? Dabi asked shyly, a tone that Izuku had never heard from his brother before. Keigo's eyes were on the ground, but he looked up as soon as Dabi spoke. His expression made it seem as though he had forgotten Dabi was even there. What? Keigo's voice cracked and his wings twitched, causing Izuku to groan internally at the train wreck in front of him. He had an idea of what was happening, and while he was very grateful, it was unbearable to watch these two fumble through a confession like this. Dabi shifted on his feet, clearly trying to figure out what to say. You asked me to come out here with you? He finally responded. Oh. Keigo spoke abruptly, like he finally remembered why they were there. Yes. You true. The blonde immediately stiffened, but a small chuckle escaped from Dabi's throat at the other hero's fumbling of words. Do you mean that I'm right? He asked, some of the nerves melting from his voice as he chuckled once again at the embarrassed blush forming on Keigo's cheeks. The silence between them was a little less awkward, but Izuku still wanted to run down there and force them to actually talk to each other. Keigo seemed to finally gain some courage after a few moments, and he planted his feet firmly on the ground before taking a deep breath and locking eyes with Dabi. I do have something I wanted to ask you, he said confidently, and Izuku was a little proud that he had finally gotten his shit together just a bit. Dabi stared at the blonde expectantly, and Izuku held his breath as he waited for Keigo to get it over with already. Would you go on a date with him? He rushed out, his words barely understandable. Izuku facepalmed, unable to believe this was the confident top 10 hero he watched defeat villains and sweet-talk civilians on a daily basis. What? Dabi deadpanned, his brows furrowed with confusion as he tried to piece out what Keigo was trying to say. Keigo took another deep breath and straightened his posture. Would you go on a date with Dash? Yes. Dabi blurted before the other man could even finish. They stared at each other for a long moment, both processing what just happened. Okay, cool. Keigo responded, not making any effort to continue the conversation further. Cool. Dabi said quietly, the blush on his face intensifying just a bit. The two men made their way back into the house as Izuku heard his mother's car pull up into the driveway. He shut his window and screeched into one of his pillows, unwilling to believe what he just witnessed. They didn't even decide what they were going to do for a date. He knew he'd have to deal with their awkwardness for the rest of the day, especially when they all sat together for dinner. No, he wasn't going to deal with this anymore. He pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to his mom as he began making his way downstairs to help her prepare for dinner. Hopefully she would see it before she got into the house, so they could get their plans started sooner rather than later. If these two idiots couldn't figure things out on their own, he would have to take things into his own hands. We stan Inko Midoriya in this house. Imo bro. Mom, do I have permission to murder Izuku? Mama Midoriya, I do not condone murder, but maybe the two of you can work it out through a spar? Smiley face. Green Gremlin, MOM? Green Gremlin. You came up with the plan. Chicken Nugget. That may be the case, But Inko is also an angel who can do no wrong. Angry Rabbit, strongly agree. Emo Bro, don't think I forgot about you giggling and adding commentary, Rumi. Angry Rabbit, and? What are you going to do about it? Chicken Nugget, hey now, let's not get out of hand. We don't need the cops called on us again. Zoom Zoom Jr., it is very honorable that you are sticking up for your romantic partner, Keigo. Mini Sleepy, Keigo is hiding under his wings in the living room right now. Chicken Nugget, shut up. Zoom Zoom, all the kid did was force you two to actually plan a date instead of staring at each other across the table like two love-sick teenagers. New York Quill, and when was the last time you had a date, Sonic? Uncle you can't just say that. Ronald McDonald, she can and she did. Rat God, I truly enjoy these conversations, they give me such an interesting view into how the human mind works. Smiley face. Dirt, I really don't like how that sounds. Uncle Sleepy. Either. Green Gremlin, there is nothing wrong with using this chat as a social experiment. It's science. Pink Gremlin, I agree, Izuku. We also have so many test subjects for our babies, smiley face. Denaman, I wish you children would change the words you use to describe your inventions, for my sanity. Yeehaw, happy face agreed. Green Gremlin, so, Isamu, now that Keigo finally asked Dabi out, does this mean you'll be asking my mom out soon? Smiley face. Mama Midoriya, Izuku Midoriya, smiley face. Green Gremlin, I have made a grave mistake. Izuku and Mei's test subjects. Denaman, Dabi and Keigo, good luck on your date tomorrow. Angry Rabbit, Keigo you better make sure this date is amazing. Uncle Loud, yeah, and don't hurt him. Chicken Nugget, thaw? Uncle Sleepy, don't laugh, we are serious. Chicken Nugget, I won't. Ronald McDonald, what's with the question marks? You should be sure that you aren't going to hurt him. Emo Bro, guys? Please. New York Quill, we are just trying to protect our little baby Emo, love. Emo Bro, I am not Zoom Zoom, debatable. Zoom Zoom, also, at Chicken Nugget don't hurt Dabi. Dirt, happy face I have access to a lot of power tools, and I am not afraid to use them. Chicken Nugget, guys? Yeehaw, I am not afraid to use my guns if anyone hurts the kid. Emo Bro, I am an adult? Mini Sleepy, she'll let them terrorize Keigo, it's funny. Chicken Nugget, I am really concerned that you all think I would hurt him? Pink Gremlin at Rat God, if Keigo hurts Dabi can I use him for experiments? Smiley face. Rat God, yes, smiley face. Chicken Nugget? Zoom Zoom Jr., please refrain from discussing human experimentation in the chat. Chicken Nugget, thank you Tenya. Zoom Zoom Jr., it would be much easier for you to be caught if there is a written trail. Emo Bro, guys, I really appreciate it but please stop threatening my date. Chicken Nugget at Mama Midoriya at Green Gremlin help? Mama Midoriya, it's okay Keigo. I am sure you know that it would be a big mistake to hurt my baby, smiley face. Green Gremlin, happy face what she said. Chicken Nugget. Nakaguro. Dabi stood in the mirror, adjusting the small bun on his head for what felt like the 40th time since he began getting ready for his date. The green locks were giving him a tough time, naturally, but they finally looked, purposefully, messy. He touched the burns on his face self-consciously, trying to remember the encouraging words his mom had spoken over the years. She also insisted that Keigo clearly liked his scars, since he was clearly interested in him enough to ask him out. Mike and Izuku had helped him pick out an outfit last night, consisting of black jeans and a gray crewneck sweatshirt with a black button up underneath. His uncle had helped him put on a bit of eyeliner that morning, insisting that it would accentuate his eyes. He had wanted to get Izuku's opinion once he was ready, but the boy had left with Mei a few hours ago to put the finishing touches on the electric whips that they had been working on. Dabi couldn't help but feel sorry for the villains that would be on the other side of Rumi and Nemuri's newest weapons. After adjusting his shirt one last time, he made his way downstairs to the living room, where a few members of the family were waiting to give him a few final pieces of advice and encouraging words. His mother was sitting with Isamu, Mike, and Shota in the living room making small talk as he walked down the stairs. They all fell silent when he finally made his presence known, giving him a once-over before showering him with compliments. My baby is so handsome. Inko gushed, getting off the couch to give him a bear hug as tears threatened to pour from her eyes. You're looking sharp, kid. Isamu chuckled at the green-haired woman's reaction, but he smiled warmly at the young man in front of him. Keigo won't know what hit him, Mike exclaimed, causing Dabi to stuff his face in his mother's hair to hide his blush. Leave the kid alone, Zashi. Shota scolded, amusement filling his eyes at his husband's teasing of their nephew. Something in his face must have cued the group in on his nervous state, because his uncle gave him a knowing look before placing a grounding hand on his shoulder and squeezing. You'll be all right, kid. Shota comforted, and Dabi relaxed just a bit. As soon as he was beginning to feel his nerves melt away, there was a knock on the door, causing his heart to hammer in his chest. It was a little strange to hear Keigo knocking on the door of a house he had a key to, but it also showed that he was trying to make this a proper date. Isamu went to open the door, falling into a natural role as the father figure scoping out his kid's date. Dabi couldn't help but grin at the sight, once again wondering when the man would actually start courting his mom. His thoughts were immediately interrupted when Keigo walked into the living room with 2 bouquets of flowers, looking more nervous than Dabi had ever seen him. The blonde was wearing a dark red button-up shirt with a dark blue jean jacket and black pants, with his wings expertly hidden underneath his layers. He had emphasized his naturally lined eyes with even more eyeliner, and Dabi couldn't help but wonder if Rumi helped him choose his outfit and get ready for the day. Hi, Keigo said reverently, giving Dabi a slow once-over that made his cheeks burn and his heart skip a beat. Hi, Dabi replied smartly, still staring at the hero in front of him with a dropped jaw and appreciative eyes. Inko mercifully stepped in to break the awkwardness, walking over to Keigo and gesturing to the flowers in his hands. In one hand he held an arrangement of dark red roses wrapped in black paper. In the other he held a bouquet of multicolored carnations. Keigo, these flowers are so lovely, Inko complimented, clearly trying to lead the blonde to the next part of the courting process. Dabi held his breath as he watched Keigo turn to his mother before hesitantly holding out the carnations. These are for you, Ms. Midoriya. His voice cracked a bit with nerves, but Inko simply smiled as she took the offered bouquet. They are beautiful, sweetheart. She pushed her nose into them, taking in the floral scent before looking back up. Thank you. Keigo then turned to Dabi, who was hoping that no one in the room could hear the pounding of his chest as he watched his date hold out the beautiful roses with a small blush on his cheeks. These are for you, Dabi. His hands reached out unconsciously, and he felt like he was watching the entire interaction from far away as he pulled the flowers close to his chest. Thank you. He muttered in bewilderment before copying his mother's actions and smelling the flowers. The 2 men stood there for a few long moments, seemingly unsure of what to do next. Once again Inko rescued them from their own awkwardness, stepping up to wrap her arm around Dabi's. Let's go put our lovely flowers into vases, honey. She pulled lightly on his arm and he followed obediently, leaving the living room as his mother pulled him into the kitchen. As he watched the woman pull out 2 colorful vases and begin filling them with water, he felt himself relaxing once again. Remember, honey, it's just Keigo, she advised as she handed him his vase and began unwrapping her own bouquet. You 2 have known each other for so long now, this isn't that different from the 2 of you hanging out like before. She carefully began placing flowers in the vase as Dabi mirrored her actions. His mother's words rang through his head, reminding him of the years of shared history between him and his date. They had hung out alone together so many times. What made this any different? Now that their feelings were out in the open, it seemed like this should feel even more relaxed and natural. His rapidly beating heart calmed as he finished placing the flowers into their new home. Thanks, Mom. He looked up at the woman with a grateful smile, and she winked at him before gesturing towards the living room. Let's get you back, I don't want you running late for your reservation. The pair made their way back to the living room, and it was clear from Keigo's relaxed demeanor that he had also gotten advice from the men in the living room. Make sure you get my baby back at a reasonable time, Keigo, Inko said with a sweet smile, but there was an edge to her tone that made Dabi shiver a bit. Why, yes, ma'am, Keigo stuttered, but luckily the Midoriya matriarch took mercy on him by replacing her icy demeanor with the familiar maternal warmth they were all used to. You two have fun, okay? She kissed Dabi's cheek as she walked by, officially dismissing them to begin their date. Inko and Izuku had planned everything out, making reservations at a fancy new restaurant downtown and buying them tickets for the latest action movie later on. It was the perfect first date, according to his mother and brother. They even made sure to get them a private room at the restaurant, making it less likely that they would be recognized by the public. Dabi had made his debut as a provisional hero under both the Hawks and Mirko agencies, which immediately skyrocketed him into the public eye. He had kept his civilian name hidden, and he made sure any defining features that his father might recognize were hidden by his hero suit. He looked so different from the boy that had left the Todoroki household all those years ago, and by some stroke of luck no one from his old life had connected Azure to the missing boy. Fire quirks were fairly common, and his support gear gave him control over his flames in ways he never had when he was still under Endeavor's thumb. Both men settled baseball caps over their heads before securing medical masks to cover their faces. It was best to wear some sort of disguise so that they were able to enjoy their day instead of being hounded by paparazzi or overzealous fans. They had also decided to keep this new phase of their relationship on the down low for now, not wanting to cause any unnecessary stirs until they figured out what they were. The walk to the train station was silent, with both of them shooting tentative glances at the other until they finally arrived on the platform. "You look nice," Keigo said quietly, and Dabi would have missed the compliment if he wasn't paying attention to everything the blonde was doing by his side. "Thank you." Dabi tried to reply confidently, but he barely managed to get the words out. "You do too," he added, wishing he could express all of the feelings he was currently experiencing. Why was this so hard? The train arrived before they could continue their stilted conversation, and it was fairly packed due to the weekend rush. They ended up standing close together, with Dabi having to wrap an arm around Keigo's waist to make sure they weren't separated. He felt their hearts beating together through their chests, and it brought a sense of calm over him. His date was just as nervous as he was, so there was no point in being awkward or unsure. "You know, I didn't take you for a flower type of guy," Dabi teased, trying to re-establish the sense of normalcy between them. His confidence clearly rubbed off on Keigo, who rolled his eyes dramatically before quipping back. "I had to pull out all the stops to make sure Inko didn't end me on sight." Dabi chuckled, happy that they had restored some sense of familiarity between them, using their common language of teasing to restore their usual rapport. The rest of the train ride was filled with casual conversation and people watching, and they ended up at their stop 30 minutes earlier than they originally planned. With nothing else to do until their reservation time, they decided to explore the area until it was time for them to head to the restaurant. There were street vendors and small shops surrounding them, giving them plenty to talk about and take in as they walked side by side throughout the crowded streets. Their shoulders kept bumping, tempting Dabi to reach out and grab Keigo's hand. He kept hesitating, unsure of what would be considered moving too fast. All of this was so new for him. He had never thought about dating until the red-winged hero had met Izuku and flew his way into their lives. Even then, he never thought his crush would be reciprocated or that Keigo would one day ask him on a date. The one thing that made him feel better was the knowledge that Keigo had never dated either, too busy dealing with the commission's demands until they found another hero to control. His mother and Netsu were already compiling evidence against them, but it would be a long time until they were able to actually act on it. Dabi made mental notes every time Keigo mentioned a dessert he especially liked, or complimented the color of a fabric or glass sculpture. He would make sure to bring the blonde something the next time they went out, if this date went well. He really hoped it would. As their reservation time approached, they began to make their way to the restaurant. Dabi was thankful that they had a bit of time to explore and get used to being around each other this way, especially now that their conversation seemed to flow naturally. He hoped they wouldn't fall back into their nervous state from before, now that it was just the two of them. They were only a block away when his eyes fell on a poster hanging on a shop's outer wall. He immediately grabbed Keigo's arm and pulled him over, his eyes wide in shock and excitement. The poster was from a promotional photo shoot the Hawks agency had done a month ago, but Dabi hadn't realized anything had been released yet. Hawks stood in the middle of the frame, his wings elongated to their full width and his signature smirk plastered on his face. Dabi thought he looked handsome, but that wasn't the reason he had dragged the hero over. In the upper left corner stood Dabi in his new hero uniform, a simple black jumpsuit with blue and white wiring and a simple black mask that covered the top half of his face. This was the first time he had ever seen himself on any type of hero merchandise, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Old anxieties began to take over his thoughts, and he tried his best to fight them down. What if Endeavor recognizes me? Do I even deserve to be up there? A hand wrapped around his fingers before squeezing it tightly to bring him back down to earth. You look great. I thought it was a nice shot of you, so I asked them to put it on the poster. Keigo said casually, like he didn't just cause Dabi's heart to melt into a puddle in his chest. You did this? Dabi's eyes found the poster again, seeing it in a different light now that he knew it was his date's doing. Keigo simply nodded as he smiled at Dabi, clearly pleased at the reaction his gesture generated. The two men stood there for a few moments, appreciating the media team's depictions of the various heroes that worked at the agency with them. It only made Dabi more excited about graduating from being a provisional hero to a fully licensed pro. He loved saving people. It gave his life meaning in a way it never had before. Hawks looks so good here. A woman's voice interrupted their moment, and Dabi turned his head a bit to find a group of people around his age standing to admire the poster as well. He ignored the jealous pang in his heart, reminding himself that his date was admired by society for both his looks and his heroics. Yeah, it's like he just keeps getting hotter and hotter. One of the men said with a smirk as he looked the poster up and down. That Azure guy is something else though. One of the women said with a grimace, and Dabi's stomach immediately dropped. Yeah, I'm not sure how he is going to be successful with those scars on his face. The original woman said as she looked at Dabi's picture in the corner of the poster. I can't believe Hawks would hire someone like that. The man said with disgust. Dabi was frozen in place. His heart pounded rapidly in his chest as his stomach pooled with acid. He couldn't move, couldn't even react as he overheard the group make more comments about his appearance and marketability. He was so stuck in his own thoughts that he didn't notice Keigo tensing next to him, glaring harshly at the group as they continued ridiculing Azure and praising Hawks. He barely registered Keigo ripping his hat and mask off before standing between the group and the poster, staring them down like they had committed some heinous crime right in front of him. Shut up now, he commanded, immediately grabbing the attention of everyone surrounding them. Dabi's breath caught in his throat as he watched Keigo fuming in front of him, clearly trying to restrain himself as he confronted the civilians. Azure is an amazing hero and person. The blonde gritted out, causing those closest to him to back away a few steps in shock. You say you don't know how he could be successful as a hero because of his looks? Keigo exclaimed, his glare deepening as he reflected on the group's earlier comments. Despite the fact that he is gorgeous, he is also one of the most passionate and hardworking heroes I have ever had the pleasure of working with. Dabi blushed at the compliment, his eyes darting between the gathering crowd and his date. I think you all should really get your eyes checked, and maybe reevaluate your idea of what a hero is. Keigo shouted, but his eyes widened a bit when he realized how many people had gathered around them. He looked to Dabi, panic evident in his eyes as people began to shout questions at the winged hero. The blonde worked his way through the crowd and grabbed Dabi's hand before pulling them away from the mass of people. It really is Hawks. Someone shouted, stirring the gathered people and causing the heads of passers-by to turn. When the mass began to follow them, they switched into a sprint, running in a random direction to put some distance between themselves and the onlookers. Dabi internally wished that Keigo had worn his wings out, if only for the option of a quick escape. The crowd seemed set on catching up to them, and a surprising number of people kept up with their fast pace. After a few blocks, they turned a corner abruptly, ensuring that their chasers lost sight of them for a few moments. Over here! A woman's voice rang out, and they turned to find one of the shop owners waving them inside. The shouts of the crowd got closer, and there seemed to be little choice but to enter the safety of the small restaurant. The two men quickly made their way through the doorway, followed by the older woman as she shut the door behind them. The restaurant was tiny but not uncomfortable. The cozy decor and dimmed lighting made it seem like you had stepped into someone's home for a dinner party. The smell of spices wafted through the air, making Dabi's stomach growl in hunger. They had definitely missed their reservation by now, and he had not eaten anything since breakfast in order to prepare for their dinner. The sounds of voices passing by the shop put him on edge, but the owner simply flipped the sign to closed and locked the door behind her. Go on, take a seat. It seems like you will have to wait for them to lose interest in finding you, she ordered as she made her way to the back of the dining room. Dabi and Keigo obeyed her order, if only for the possibility of escaping the crowd pursuing them. They sat at the closest table and immediately opened the menu, neither ready to talk about the impassioned speech Keigo gave before they were chased. The woman came back out of the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of water, placing them before the men as though they were regular customers. Would you like something to eat? She asked, her eyes sparkling with a kindness that reminded Dabi of his mother. He looked at Keigo for guidance in the situation, but secretly hoped they would stay to eat here. Would you mind giving us a few minutes to look over the menu? Keigo was using his hero voice, and the smile on his face was the one he used for the public. It was too trained, and Dabi had to look away after a moment. This side of Keigo always reminded him that the man in front of him had been molded into a hero his entire life, and only recently gained the freedom he deserved. They went back to looking over the menu, falling back into an uncomfortable silence that neither of them knew how to break. Dabi debated on what to say when his date took the first step in conversation. The salmon looks good, Keigo said before taking a sip of water, but Dabi refused to go back to the awkwardness from before. So, you think I'm gorgeous? He asked casually, but he had to control his laughter when Keigo nearly choked on his beverage. The blonde looked away sheepishly, a pretty blush forming on his cheeks as he thought over his response. I did say that, didn't I? Keigo looked embarrassed for a split second, before the confident man that Dabi had grown to know seemed to blossom before his eyes. His date leaned forward on his hands, shooting Dabi a cocky smirk. You didn't seem to mind it, though, he stated coolly, causing Dabi's heart to explode in his chest. This man was going to kill him one of these days. Dabi quickly gained control over himself, unwilling to be the only one flustered between the two of them. What if I liked it? He leaned forward just enough, so that their noses were only an inch or 2 apart. Keigo spluttered a bit, pulling back as Dabi chuckled a bit at his victory. Once the other had collected himself a bit, things seemed to return to their normal playfulness yet again. They decided what they wanted to eat, choosing to share a few things so that they could sample multiple dishes at once. The menu was filled with dishes straight out of a mother's kitchen, and he was already salivating at the thought of a nice home-style meal. Have you decided? The woman returned at the perfect time, and Dabi couldn't help but wonder what her quirk was. She seemed to appear whenever someone needed her the most, if her earlier rescue was anything to go by. They placed their orders, once again thanking her for her hospitality before she went to prepare their meals. They continued chatting, relaxing now that they were in a safe space away from the prying eyes and cutting comments of the public. He had been upset over everything they had overheard, but then Keigo had called him gorgeous. He had never been called gorgeous before, and something about the word stuck with him as he listened to Keigo talk about Izuku's progress in training. The way the blonde's eyes lit up while talking about the kid made Dabi's heart flutter. He was happy to be with someone who cared about his little brother just as much as he did. The food came out quickly, plates loaded with meat and veggies paired with rice and stews. Dabi's stomach growled as everything was placed in front of them, and Keigo seemed to be salivating at the sight of their meal. Please enjoy. The woman smiled warmly before disappearing once again into the kitchen. The pair dug into the food immediately, distributing the food so that they each got to try the various dishes in front of them. They were so focused on satisfying their hunger that they didn't even speak. Until the plates were empty, both of them full to the brim from the delicious meal. That had to be some of the best food I've ever had in my life, Keigo said as he slumped back, a wide smile on his face. We have to take the family here sometimes. Mom would love this place. Dabi closed his eyes, relaxing now that he had eaten. Finished. The woman reappeared, smiling down at the empty plates as she began to clear them. Yes, it was delicious. Thank you again for rescuing us and being such a gracious host. Keigo smiled, his expression genuine instead of the trained one he used during hero work. It's the least I can do for the heroes that saved me. She winked and returned to the kitchen before either man could process her statement. They locked eyes across the table, wearing matching expressions of confusion. "Do you recognize her?" Dabi finally asked, searching his mind for the woman's face. They had been on so many missions since he got his provisional license, it was hard to keep track of all of the rescues he had made. Keigo shook his head, clearly trying to do the same as they waited for her to return. Dabi was secretly wondering how she could recognize him outside of his hero uniform, but his scars were probably what gave him away. He normally covered them with a mask or makeup when he went out, but his mom had convinced him to let them be for the night. She came back out with 2 plates of cake, smiling at their curious expressions as she set them on the table. "Do you remember the villain attack on the hospital a few weeks ago?" she asked patiently, waiting for realization to fill the hero's eyes. Dabi specifically recalled carrying patients out of the burning building on his back, watching as Keigo carried people out of the upper windows. "You were there?" Keigo suddenly sat up, looking her over for injuries as though the attack was recent. "I was, and this young man here carried me out before the room I was in burst into flames." She put a hand on Dabi's shoulder, and he stared at her with wide eyes as recognition filled his mind. He had never met anyone he had saved before, although he had seen the other heroes in his family get stopped on the streets when grateful citizens recognized them. He remembered a woman clutching onto him as they rushed through the door of the hospital. She patted his cheek after he helped her onto the back of an ambulance, thanking him profusely as he began to walk away. He suddenly recalled that she had recommended he visit her restaurant, but the offer had fled his mind as he ran back into the burning building. "I'm sorry I didn't recognize you before," Dabi said shyly, embarrassed that he hadn't recognized her until this moment. She squeezed his shoulder as Keigo chuckled at his date's sheepish expression. "It's okay, dear. I'm just happy the universe brought you two here so that I could properly thank you. Now eat up." She gestured to the desserts in front of them before turning to walk away. "Wait, we never got your name, Ms.?" Keigo interjected before she could return to the kitchen. "You can call me Grandma Izuku." She introduced herself, making a point to not ask for the men's real names. Dabi was glad she respected their boundaries. Most civilians wanted all of the information they could have on the pros that were in the spotlight each day. They glanced at their plates, choosing not to mention the heart drawn in red icing on their cake slices. The few sips of tea they had each taken had helped them digest a bit of their meal, leaving just enough room for the delicious sweets in front of them. "I feel like Izuku is going to adopt a new grandmother when we bring everyone here," Keigo said offhandedly, causing Dabi to laugh and almost choke on the bite of cake in his mouth. "I think we can take credit for adopting her, thank you very much," Dabi said with a shit-eating grin, but he was excited for everyone to meet the kind woman that had saved their first date. After they had finished up, Grandma Izuku refused any type of payment from them. They tried to insist, but finally settled on promising her they'd bring Izuku and Inko there soon. They said their final goodbyes, already missing the welcoming energy of the small restaurant as they began their journey down the sidewalk. They had been in the restaurant for much longer than expected, and they were too far from the theater to make it in time for their movie. It seemed that their original plan for the night was being completely thrown out the window, and it was time for them to improvise yet again. As they walked down the sidewalk to find something else to do for the rest of the night, they gravitated towards each other. After their shoulders brushed for the 10th or so time, Keigo reached out to grasp Dabi's hand in his. The street was fairly empty, and the blonde stopped them at a corner before turning to the taller man with a serious expression. "You know I meant everything I said back there, right?" His eyes were earnest, pulling Dabi in for a moment before he was able to process the words spoken to him. His heartbeat was pounding in his chest, and he was unable to form any words in response. He simply nodded, although his insecurities were trying to convince him that Keigo was lying to him. He looked away so that the other man wouldn't be able to see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Dabi, look at me," Keigo said firmly, giving his hand a squeeze as he waited patiently for Dabi to comply. His eyes hesitantly rose to meet those golden orbs that had stolen his heart, and his stomach flipped at the affection radiating from the other man's eyes. Before either of them knew it, their faces were only an inch or so apart. "You're gorgeous," Keigo stated firmly, his conviction almost convincing Dabi that the words were true. Their faces drifted closer together, and Dabi distantly realized that he was about to have his first kiss. He pushed his racing thoughts to the back of the mind, unwilling to let his anxiety ruin this moment for him. His lips were about to brush Keigo's when a loud crash rang out from an alleyway nearby. They jumped apart, their senses alert as they turned to the dark alley to check where the noise was coming from. To their relief and mild frustration, it was just a stray cat that had jumped onto an overturned trash can. Keigo let out an airy chuckle at their misfortune, and neither man knew how to recreate the moment that had just been interrupted. Dabi simply reached out to grasp the blonde's hand before continuing their trek down the sidewalk, hopeful that they would be able to finish what they had started later in the night. They passed by restaurants and small shops, the streets getting busier and busier as they returned to the main part of the shopping district. A neon sign in the distance caught their attention, their faces breaking out into large grins as they found the perfect activity for the rest of their date. Keigo bumped his shoulder into Dabi's, his golden eyes reflecting the string lights hanging around them. "I'll race you," he challenged, his tone giddy with excitement. Dabi couldn't refuse him, especially when there was a challenge to be won. "You're on." Dabi smirked as they readied themselves, keeping their eyes out for any civilians or blockages in their path. Once they were both ready, they began counting down together. 1, 2, 3. Then they were off running, both men laughing at themselves as they made their way closer to their destination. The race was fairly even, both of them taking the lead every few seconds as they gained on the finish line. Dabi was about to secure his victory when a red feather hit him in the face, stopping him in his tracks and almost causing him to trip over his feet. "I win," Keigo announced proudly. Dabi ripped the feather from his face with a scowl and pointed it at his date. "You're a cheater," he exclaimed, but his anger was mostly for show as he joined Keigo at the entrance of their destination. "Let's see how he likes it when I beat him at every game," Dabi thought to himself as they entered the multicolored space. He looked up at the sign one last time with a mischievous grin. "Dave's Arcade." "It's not cheating, it was just strategy," Keigo pouted, crossing his arms over his chest as they made their way to the counter to get coins for the games. The lights and sounds of the arcade caused adrenaline to start pumping through his veins, and a familiar sense of competitiveness began to overcome him. Neither of the men had been able to go to arcades as a kid, but had grown to love them over the years of taking Izuku and the other kids to various arcades throughout the area. It was nice to escape the stresses of life for a few hours, your only focus being who was able to collect more tickets or win more games. They filled a large bucket with coins, making sure to grab an extra one for the mountain of tickets they were hoping to collect. "Where to first?" Dabi asked as he scanned the area for anything that caught his interest. Keigo suddenly grabbed his hand and pointed in the distance, where an air hockey table sat waiting for them. "Think you can beat me, birdie?" Dabi asked cockily, confidence filling him for once. "Let's find out, hot stuff." Keigo winked, causing Dabi to lose his cool for a moment before he pulled them to the table. They immediately chose their sides and put coins in, grinning as the game came to life. There was a fierce competition, with neither one of them taking it easy on the other. The puck flew across the table at high speeds, forcing both of them to be on top of their game as points were scored and goals were blocked. The score was tied, and Dabi kept his eyes trained on the puck to ensure his opponent wouldn't win. The puck came hurling towards him, and in a split second he was reaching out to block it. It skirted past his hand and into his goal, solidifying a win for his date. He looked up, ready to complain and feign annoyance at Keigo's win, but the sight in front of him stopped him in his tracks. The blonde was smiling brightly, his eyes lit up by the neon lights of the games surrounding them. His face was filled with pure joy as he laughed and threw light-hearted taunts at Dabi. "He's beautiful." Dabi shook himself out of his thoughts and made his way to the blonde's side of the table. He had a sudden surge of confidence, wrapping an arm around Keigo's waist and pulling him into his side. "Good job, birdie." He spoke into Keigo's ear, delighting in the small shiver he felt running through the shorter man's body. "Let's find something I can beat you at." Dabi turned them around and began walking towards the rest of the games. They spent hours in the arcade, even though it was crowded with families and teenagers enjoying a night out. No one recognized them in the dim lighting of the arcade, but they made sure to put their masks on if anyone got too close to them. They did not want a repeat of the incident from earlier, especially now that they had finally gotten more comfortable with each other. The men played every game that piqued their interest, from racing simulators to the basketball shootout. Their pile of tickets was growing too large for their singular bucket, and they began transferring coins into their pockets so that they could use the second bucket for the massive winnings. Once they had run out of coins, they decided it was time to spend their tickets on a few prizes. I think we should get the Hawks plushie. Keigo's eyes sparkled with humor as he pointed at the giant plush hanging from the ceiling above the prize counter. Dabi eyed the stuffed rendition of his date warily, trying to imagine how difficult it would be to get it home on the train. I think we should get squishy hands so that we can throw them at Izuku when he is being a brat. Dabi pointed to the container of sticky toys underneath the glass, already imagining the look on Izuku's face when he hit him in the forehead with one of them. Their light-hearted banter continued for a few minutes, trying to decide the best way to use their winnings. They had arrived at an impasse, but Keigo's eyes suddenly lit up as he spotted something in the distance. He pulled on the sleeve of Dabi's shirt and discreetly pointed towards the end of the counter. "Dabs, look at that kid's shirt," the blonde said with a wide smile. Dabi's gaze followed the direction of his date's pointed finger, and when he saw the little boy, his heart began hammering in his chest. The kid looked around 6 or 7 years old, barely able to see above the counter as his parents pointed at the various toys he could use his small handful of tickets to get. His arms and the left side of his face and neck were covered with burns that couldn't have been more than a few months old. He was wearing a black t-shirt with blue flames on the sleeves, but it was the front of the shirt that brought tears to Dabi's eyes. In the middle of the boy's chest was a rendition of Dabi in his hero uniform, looking like he was ready for battle. Azure was written in bright blue and white letters underneath his image. There was no official Azure merchandise out, so the shirt must have been custom-made. Dabi stood there staring for a few moments until Keigo nudged him and gestured towards the buckets of tickets in front of them. Dabi immediately nodded in silent agreement before wiping the small pool of tears from his eyes. He grabbed the bucket and made his way over to the family. "Excuse me, is it all right if I give your kid my tickets?" Dabi asked quietly, not wanting to bring too much attention to the interaction. He wasn't expecting to be recognized in his civilian clothes, so when the kid's eyes lit up in recognition, he had to hold a finger to his lips. "Azure," the boy whispered, his voice laced with excitement. Dabi smiled, his heart bursting at its seams as he watched the child turn to his parents with a bright smile. The couple was watching the interaction with tears in their eyes, and he had to control himself so that he didn't burst into tears of his own. Damn those adopted Midoriya genes. Dabi handed the boy's dad the bucket of tickets and knelt down so that he was eye level with him. Up close could see how much time and effort went into the custom shirt, and he couldn't help but wonder who made it. "Can you sign something for me?" the kid asked, his eyes glittering in awe as he gazed at his hero. "Of course, kiddo." Dabi hoped he was doing everything right. He had never interacted with a fan like this before. After signing everything in the kid's backpack and taking a discreet selfie, the boy, whose name ended up Akihiko, decided to focus his attention on the prize counter. Keigo had now joined them, but he had put his mask on so that he didn't take any attention away from Dabi during his moment. You know, he was so scared of going outside after he left the hospital. The boy's mother said, her eyes trained on her son as her eyes filled with tears. "Then he saw you standing on the screen with Mirko after a successful fight, and he wanted to know everything about you," she continued, and Dabi's stomach twisted with an unidentifiable feeling. He remained silent, allowing the woman to finish her story. "He kept begging us for Azure merchandise, but there was nothing out there. We ended up having to learn how to make our own." She gestured to the t-shirt, and Dabi was no longer able to control the tears in his eyes. He never thought he'd be able to inspire anyone as a hero, especially not like this. A hand slipped through his, squeezing tightly in a show of support as Keigo stepped next to him. Dabi's inability to speak in the moment must have been obvious, as his date took over the conversation from there. Keigo ended up with their contact information and the beginnings of a merchandising deal using the mom's designs. He also invited the family to tour his agency and spend a day with Azure in the near future. Dabi was able to say a few goodbyes before they parted ways with the family for the night. "It never gets old." Keigo said contemplatively as they walked out of the exit and into the cool night air. Dabi thought about the mother's story, and about all of the other kids out there that might need a hero that looked like him. He'd try his best to be the type of hero they deserved. I'm sure it doesn't. He finally replied, a small smile on his face as he thought over the events of the day. The night air felt good on his skin after a few hours spent in the crowded building. Why don't we walk around for a little bit, Birdie? He asked as he squeezed Keigo's hand. Dabi was filled with glee at the sight of the small blush on Keigo's cheeks, making a mental note to pull out that nickname more often. The streets were quiet as they walked around, talking about everything and nothing as they clasped each other's hands. There were clouds covering the stars, but the neon signs of shops and restaurants painted the air with artificial stars. Dabi remembered the feeling of Keigo's face only centimeters away from his, and his mind flooded with possibility. He stopped on a corner, positioning them underneath a half-lit sign for a flower shop. You okay? Keigo asked quietly, his golden eyes lit up in various shades of blues and reds. Dabi could count the tiny freckles on his nose from this distance, something he would surely do another time. His sole focus at the moment was claiming his first kiss. Dabi replied, his eyes trained on the other man's lips. Keigo seemed to realize what was happening, as his eyes began to dart between Dabi's lips and his eyes. Their faces inched closer and closer together, the anticipation of the moment overtaking them both. Dabi swore he could feel the seconds passing by as his eyes fluttered shut, his lips only a breath away from Keigo's. A drop of water hit his eyelid, causing his eyes to flutter open and his movements to stop as more droplets began assaulting his face. Keigo moved back a step before looking up at the sky, which seemed to choose that moment to unleash a torrent of rain that began assaulting them from every direction. Follow me, the blonde yelled, grabbing Dabi's hand and pulling him before the other had time to react. They ran for a few blocks before coming across the park they had passed earlier, and Keigo pulled them through the entrance and up the steps of a nearby gazebo with ease. They were both panting a bit from running in the rain, but before they knew it, laughter overtook them both. It seemed the universe did not want them to have their first kiss tonight. Dabi felt like he was soaked down to his bones, his clothes and hair stuck to his skin uncomfortably as he bent over with laughter. Hanging out with the smile hero had taught him that the best way to get through life was to find joy in the bad moments, and that was what he was choosing to do. Both he and Keigo were bent over, clutching their stomachs from laughing so hard. They looked up at each other, their eyes meeting as they smiled at their misfortune. Keigo reached out to brush a strand of hair out of his face, but he kept his hand on Dabi's cheek as they both straightened up into standing positions. Their bodies seemed to sense out the other as they twisted into a sweet embrace. The water dripping from their clothes did not deter them from wrapping their arms around each other sweetly, gazing into each other's eyes as they defied the universe one last time. I'm going to kiss you now, Keigo declared, daring the cosmos to interrupt them again. Yes, please, Dabi whispered in the minimal space between them, closing his eyes once again as they drifted closer. Finally, their lips met. Kissing Keigo was like nothing he had ever experienced before. It was as if his fire had ignited inside him in a way that he never wanted to extinguish. It was clear that neither of them had any experience, but it didn't matter when the other man was so impossibly close. He could stand there forever, kissing that beautiful man in a gazebo while the entire world flooded around them. Izuku adjusted his bow tie as he and Mei made their way into the living room, where everyone was waiting for their presentation to begin. The lights were low, creating a dramatic effect as the two inventors stepped in front of their audience. Mei pressed a button on her bracelet, causing a spotlight to appear on the pair as they gestured towards the display between them. Welcome to the first presentation of Hatsum and Midoriya Industries. Mei spoke dramatically, and her announcement was rewarded with enthusiastic applause from the group gathered before them. It was Izuku's turn to speak and to introduce their newest invention. May I introduce our latest invention, the multifunctional whip made with every hero in mind, the villain cracker. The drape over the display dropped, revealing a dozen or so whips with different functions and capabilities. May dove right into a thorough explanation of the features and customizations they had made to the whips, and Izuku couldn't help but notice how much better she had gotten at presenting since she first joined the family. He watched with a wide smile as she finished her explanation, which was once again responded to with applause. We'd also like to thank the Ingenium Agency for their gracious donation of materials for the waterproof barrier on the whips. Izuku added, winking at Tensei and Tenya as the duo we patted on the back for their contribution. While they originally were going to make whips only for a few people in the family, they had ended up making whips for everyone. The possibilities were endless, and it was fun to test out the weapons on training dummies at UA. He hoped his mom would never need hers. He did feel better about her having a weapon on hand at all times. Shota had even assisted everyone with their permits so that they could use the whips when needed. His uncle had tried to act unamused at the idea of using the whips, but his excitement was evident through his thorough preparation and constant questions about the safety of the features. They had customized them for each user, making sure that Inko's whip let out a much lower electric charge than the rest due to her civilian status. Gina's whip was woven with fabric that he could control, while Shota's was made of a similar material to his capture weapon. The whips were also made with each hero's color scheme in mind, so that no one could misplace theirs or accidentally take someone else's. At the end of their presentation, they called each hero up and gave them a brief demonstration on how to activate the charge and the custom features for their quirks. No using whips in the house, Inko called, causing a majority of the group to run to the backyard. Mei and Izuku had set up a few practice dummies, but most of their training would happen at hero agencies or on UA's campus. Keigo, Rumi, Dabi, and Tensei were the first ones out of the door. Cackling could be heard from the group as they scrambled to the backyard. Shota had stayed back with Izuku's mom and Snipe, who were carefully looking over their new weapons and discussing alternating Izuku's training schedule so that he and Imuri could give them all tips on using the whips. Genist began walking towards the backyard, where Emi was currently trying to detangle Tensei and Rumi's whips without getting electrocuted. Really? You too? Isamu asked with a chuckle, clearly surprised that the normally put-together man would want to join in on the chaos. Genist responded with a sheepish shrug, holding up his whip with an excited glint in his eyes. The children worked hard on these, it would be a shame not to use them. Izuku smiled as he was joined by Hitoshi and Tenya as he watched everyone enjoying the inventions he and Mei had spent so much time on. His whip was begging to be used, but he had gotten enough hours of practice in the lab. For now, he'd let his family enjoy their use of the practice dummies and the light-hearted chaos they were causing. I am so proud of you too. Netsu gushed as he made his way over to the group of 12-year-olds. You worked so hard on these support items. I can't wait to see what you do in the future. The principal hopped up on Hitoshi's shoulder to be able to speak face-to-face with the kids, much to the boys' dismay. Thank you for your mentorship, Netsu. We would not have been able to do it if it weren't for everyone's support. Izuku replied with a big smile. He was always thankful for the support his family gave him, and he hoped that he was earning it. Those that had chosen to stay in the living room migrated to the backyard eventually, laughing as Rumi chased Keigo with her whip or as Mike hit himself in the face with his new support weapon. The kids were all staying for a sleepover that night, and Izuku was excited to experience Mei's first sleepover as a group. His mom had already prepared snacks and they would be setting up the living room for a movie night once everyone left. He was looking forward to relaxing with his friends after the week he'd had at school. One of the second years had tripped him down a flight of stairs, causing him to gain a big bruise on his back that he had been trying to hide throughout the week. Izuku was slow to react during one of his training sessions with Shota due to his injury, but the man simply came to the conclusion that he was tired and needed a break. Izuku was told to take off a few days of training, which he gratefully accepted as he waited for the bruise to disappear. Izuku would have to be extra careful changing in front of Tenya and Hitoshi, as both boys knew he shouldn't have any training injuries after a few days off. If either of his friends noticed his bruise, they would tell the adults, and Izuku wouldn't be able to stop them from taking him out of Aldera if they knew he was being physically assaulted. Then they'd know how worthless you really are. His mind helpfully added, "Bye, Squirt. I'll see you tomorrow morning, okay?" Dabi ruffled his hair as he followed Keigo, Rumi, and Tensei out of the house for the night. The young adults were going to have a night out after a particularly busy week at their agencies. The rest of the heroes had left for the night, leaving Izuku and his friends in the house with Inko to supervise. Be safe, and don't do anything too illegal. Inko called as she descended the stairs with an armful of blankets. We won't. The group called as Dabi shut the door behind them. Why don't you kids change into your pajamas and then we can get you set up for movie night? Inko instructed as she began setting up the couches for their sleepover. After they were changed, they made their way downstairs, already debating which movies to watch first. Inko laughed at their antics and said goodnight, insisting that they come find her if they needed anything. The group decided on a horror movie, something that Hitoshi recommended after watching it with his dad's one night. According to the purple-haired boy, Mike had accidentally used his quirk after a particularly scary jump scare. They settled in with snacks and drinks, ready for a night of relaxing with their friends. Izuku was a bit nervous about sleeping on the couch with his bruised back, but he had played off injuries before. If he woke up feeling stiff, he could easily slip in an early morning shower and take pain medication before his friends woke up. Tenya and Mei fell asleep after the movie, both tired from an evening of attacking practice dummies and running around with the family in the backyard. Izuku and Hitoshi had always suffered with a bit of insomnia, although it had gotten better over the years. They laid on the two larger couches with their heads near each other so that they could have a quiet conversation without disturbing their friends. Hitoshi had been quiet for a few minutes, and Izuku assumed he had fallen asleep until the boy quietly whispered his name. Izuku, you still up? He twisted his head so that he could hear the purple-haired boy without disturbing Mei and Tenya. Yeah, Toshi. You okay? Izuku whispered back, curious to see what his friend wanted to say. Do you ever think about how lucky we are? Hitoshi asked as he stared up at the ceiling, and Izuku didn't have to ask him to clarify what he meant. For a quirkless kid and a boy with an evil quirk, they were living a pretty amazing life. Most kids in their situation would be abused or neglected, tossed away by society without ever being able to achieve their dreams. Hitoshi had told Izuku and Tenya about his early childhood, being forced into a muzzle and forbidden from speaking to other children. Izuku's dad had left the moment he found out he was quirkless, and his mother had been nothing but supportive of his dreams. They had created their own family over the years of accidentally adopting people, but he still didn't have any friends at school. The ache in his back was a painful reminder of his daily reality, where most of the world believed he wasn't even human. Yeah, we are lucky. Izuku responded half-heartedly, his mind reliving all of his most painful moments. Losing his childhood friend, who went from Kaken to Baku, the taunts from his teachers, the physical abuse from his peers. Do you ever think about the other kids? The ones like us? Hitoshi's question broke Izuku out of his thoughts. He was the only quirkless kid that he knew, but there were kids at Aldra with less than favorable quirks like Hitoshi. He had seen a girl with a knife-based quirk getting harassed in the hallway just a few days ago. Of course I do. Izuku responded quickly. He was constantly thinking about other quirkless kids, the ones that needed someone to stand up and fight on their behalf. It was why he wanted to be the first quirkless hero, to prove that they weren't less than those born with powers. We should talk to our parents about trying to do more community outreach to kids like that. I'm sure if everyone in our family put their minds together, we could really make a change. Hitoshi's voice was wistful, like he had imagined this idea over and over again. Izuku thought it was a good idea in theory, but wouldn't it make it seem like he and Hitoshi were charity cases? The public would only view them as publicity stunts, two outcasts that the heroes took pity on to help them achieve their dreams. Could they ever be taken seriously as pro-heroes if they did something like that? His quirklessness wasn't something he tried to highlight, especially now that his combat and weapon skills more than made up for his lack of a quirk. When he wasn't at school, he sometimes forgot there was anything wrong with him, especially when everyone in his family treated him equally. What would he do if he was forced to face other quirkless kids? Would he have to face what his life could have been like if he wasn't so lucky? What would his mentors do if they saw how little power quirkless people really had in society? Would they leave him? His thoughts were racing as he listened to Hitoshi's soft snores, the purple-haired boy oblivious to his friend's internal dialogue. Izuku came to a conclusion as he felt his eyes grow heavy and sleep finally began to overtake him. He would never tell his mom what was really going on at school, and he'd try to discourage Hitoshi from doing anything until they were at least at UA and had established themselves as heroes in training. Everything was riding on them becoming heroes in their own right. His eyes slowly closed as he felt himself slip into his dreams. Nakaguro Nakaguro. Izuku woke up to the sound of his friends chatting and the smell of food wafting in from the dining room. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his back made him flop back down and wince in agony. Sleeping on the couch really wasn't a good idea, but there was no way his mom and friends wouldn't question him if he slept in his own bed during the sleepover. After taking a few steadying breaths, he forced himself off the couch, wincing in pain as he straightened up into a standing position. He made his way to the dining room, taking a seat next to Mei as he tried to mask his pain. Morning, Izuku. Hitoshi grunted, taking a sip out of the mug of coffee. He was clutching to his chest like a lifeline. We didn't wake you up because you seemed to be resting peacefully, but your mother had to leave after making breakfast for an emergency meeting. Tenya explained as he began to pile food on a plate before passing it to Izuku. I really appreciate that, guys. He took a few bites of food and a grateful sip of coffee before turning to Mei. Did you enjoy your first sleepover? Izuku asked, smiling when the girl began nodding her head furiously. We have to do this all the time now, Mei exclaimed before shoveling food into her mouth. Izuku grinned before focusing his attention back on his food so that he and his friends could get the rest of the day started. They were planning on going to the beach, which they had recently finished cleaning up. Families were already spending their days walking down the shoreline and enjoying the sea breeze, which no longer reeked of garbage. It would be their first time going to Dagoba for relaxation, and Izuku couldn't wait to enjoy the fruits of his labor. A sudden pain in his back caused a wave of anxiety to flush over him as he realized he had not thought about the fact that he would most likely be shirtless during their beach day. He pushed his chair back suddenly, standing up as his heart began racing frantically. I'll be right back. He rushed out as he made his way towards the stairs. Izuku? Are you all right? Tenya called behind him, and he quickly plastered a smile on his face before turning around. Yeah. I just can't remember if I washed my swimming trunks or not, so I need to go check. Izuku hoped his lie was believable, but he was more focused on getting up the stairs with his aching back. He tried to ascend them as normally as he could, but he had to take brief pauses every few steps. He breathed out a sigh of relief as he finally reached his door, shutting it behind him as he racked his mind to a solution for his problem. He could always lie and say he had been researching skin cancer recently and he was wearing a shirt to reduce his risk of sun damage. It wouldn't be the strangest thing he had ever done. He could also pretend to fall and act like the bruise was new, depending on its coloring. He tore his sleep shirt off as he made his way towards his mirror, turning around so that he could view his back and assess how fresh the injury looked. The bruise was a mix of dark blues and purples. There was very faint yellowing around the edges, but he could always brush off any suspicions. Just as Izuku was planning how he could safely fall down the stairs without further injury, the door opened, causing him to desperately try to throw his shirt on before anyone saw his bruised back. His efforts were futile. Izuku! Hitoshi's voice cracked as he stared at his friend with a horrified expression. Izuku finished pulling his shirt over his head as he tried to come up with a plausible excuse for his injury. Before he could think of anything, Hitoshi entered the room and strode towards him. Who did this to you? Hitoshi asked quietly, and Izuku felt guilty when he saw the tears in his friend's eyes. Izuku shuffled, unsure what he could say in this situation. Why did you follow me up here? He said, trying to distract Hitoshi from what he just saw. What? Hitoshi looked at Izuku like he had grown a third eye. I mean, you followed me. Izuku tried to sound annoyed, desperately hoping his friend would drop the topic and move on. Your back is bruised up like someone beat you and you're worried about me following you? Hitoshi practically yelled, his tone starting to grate on Izuku's nerves. I'm fine, Izuku seethed, his anger getting the best of him. You're not fine. Who did that to you? Hitoshi stared him down, clearly awaiting an answer that wasn't coming. The purple-haired boy's eyes suddenly widened, and his face paled as he seemed to come up with an explanation for Izuku's injuries. Did one of the adults do that to you? Hitoshi asked quietly, tears continuing to stream down his face. Izuku's chest tightened at the accusation, and he couldn't believe Hitoshi would dare insinuate something like that. What the hell? It wasn't anyone in the family. Izuku tried to push past his friend to get to the doorway, but Hitoshi grabbed his arm. Then who was it? You have to tell someone. Hitoshi pleaded. I just fell at school, okay? Why are you being such a freak? Izuku yelled, finally at his breaking point. He just wanted to be left alone, no one else needed to be involved. That's a lie and you know it. Hitoshi raised his voice to match Izuku's. What do you want me to say? That I'm weak and need everyone's protection? I don't need anyone's help. Izuku screamed, once again trying to get away from Hitoshi. The pair didn't even notice when Mei and Tenya stepped into the doorway, matching looks of concern on their faces as they tried to figure out what was going on. Of course not. But you need to tell your mom so she can get that place shut down. Hitoshi's voice broke once again as tears continued to stream down his face. Izuku felt his rage consume him as he saw the pitying expression on his friend's face. I will never do that. I need to show everyone that I can handle the pressure. Izuku turned away from Hitoshi and faced the wall, feeling like he was suffocating in his emotions. He wanted to leave more than anything. He truly didn't want to say anything he would regret. But the anger was consuming him, and he didn't know how to fight it. Izuku, please. You are the strongest person I know. Hitoshi tried to take a step towards Izuku, but seemed to think better of it. Everyone needs help sometimes. The boy's voice had returned to a normal level. You'll never understand, you at least have a quirk. Izuku muttered, still unwilling to turn around in case his anger overwhelmed him again. You're being selfish, Izuku. Hitoshi stated plainly, but Izuku felt like a knife had been twisted into his back. You need to think about the other kids at your school, the ones that are going through the same thing you are. You actually have the power to do something. Hitoshi's voice was laced with frustration and anger. Izuku wished this conversation was over. He wanted his friend to understand that his mind was made up already. He turned around, hoping to convince his friend to see his point of view. I have to prove I am strong without a quirk. If I can't handle a bit of bullying, how am I going to handle the public when I become a hero? Izuku felt like he was pleading. He desperately needed Hitoshi to understand his reasoning. Instead of understanding, though, it seemed like Izuku's explanation only worked to anger his friend even more. You know, being a hero isn't about the quirk, right? Hitoshi let out a shuddered breath before continuing. It's about saving people. But I guess you forgot about that, huh? He sent a withering glare at Izuku before turning and walking towards the door. Tenya and Mei were standing in the room, both shifting awkwardly. It was clear they both were unsure about how to intervene in the situation. Right before Hitoshi stepped out of the room, he paused in the doorway and turned his head towards Izuku. Let me know when you remember that. Hitoshi sucked his teeth and left the room, and Izuku listened silently as he heard his friend walk down the stairs with finality. Tenya and Mei stood frozen for a few moments before turning to Izuku with concern in their eyes. Izuku, surely you and Hitoshi can work to understand each other on this. I am sure it will blow over in no time. Tenya moved towards him, but he held his hand up. He was trembling where he stood, unable to tell if it was from anger or devastation. Memories of Bakugo and his other childhood friends pushing him away began to flash through his mind. Leave. Izuku whispered. I know you want to. Izuku? What are you talking about? Mei's eyes were filled with unshed tears, but he was so tired. Leave. He turned towards Mei and Tenya, pointing to the door and walking forward so he could corral them out of his room. The pair looked heartbroken, but didn't argue with him as he slammed the door behind them. He slid down to the ground, stuffing his face into his hands when he heard the front door shut after a few minutes. He wasn't sure how long he sat there as tears fell silently down his cheeks and onto the ground beneath him. So many emotions ran through his mind and he wasn't able to separate them out from each other. Sadness turned into anger and frustration, the pressure building in his chest until he felt like he needed to burst. His eyes landed on the punching bag he kept stashed away in his closet, and he pulled himself off the ground and made his way over to it. After lugging it to the center of the room, he cracked his knuckles and took a stance, not even wrapping his hands before he began pummeling the bag with punches and kicks. Distantly, he knew he was sobbing and screaming, but it didn't fully register as his mind focused on the satisfying pain in his knuckles. Suddenly, a pair of strong arms wrapped around him and pulled him down to the ground. Izuku immediately escaped the grip and pinned the person to the ground, ready to punch the intruder. Suku? What the fuck? Dabi laid there, pinned down by Izuku's knee and trying to escape the hold of the younger boy. Izuku immediately backed up, his breath becoming labored as he realized that he almost hurt his older brother in his blind rage. Dabi approached him carefully, holding his hands out as he crawled over to where Izuku was leaning against his bed. "It's me, Squirt. What's going on?" His older brother spoke softly, finally reaching Izuku and tentatively placing his hands on his shoulders. The younger boy immediately broke down again, the sobs racking his entire body and taking away his ability to respond. Dabi pulled him to his chest, running a hand down his back to try to get him to calm down before he hyperventilated. "I'm here, Izuku. I'm here." The words calmed him a bit, allowing him to finally ask the question that had been on his mind since Hitoshi turned his back to him after their argument. "Why do they always leave me?" His voice wavered as he spoke, and his brother stared at him in confusion and worry. Izuku knew that he had messed up, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. He wasn't sure if he wanted to fix it. A voice deep inside his head begged him to find his friends and apologize immediately, but another voice told him that he didn't need them. Dabi seemed to be at a loss for words as he clutched Izuku close to him, stroking his back instead of answering his question. He knew he wasn't truly alone, he still had a family at the end of the day. But there was now a hole in his chest that he wasn't sure he'd be able to fill now that he'd pushed away his friends. He had grown so used to having them that he had forgotten the emptiness that accompanied loneliness. Midoriya Inko added Takami Keigo, Aizawa Shota, and 10 others. Midoriya Inko, we have a problem. Aizawa Shota, Eraserhead, I agree. Hitoshi won't tell us what happened, but it seems like the kids had some sort of falling out. Midoriya Dab, Azure, I found Izuku sobbing and punching his knuckles raw when I got home. He asked me why everyone leaves him. Fukukado Emi, Ms. Joke, poor kiddo. I think we should really consider getting him an official therapist instead of only relying on our weekly sessions together. Kayama Namuri, Midnight, I agree, but I also think we shouldn't put too much pressure on the kids if they dealt with something emotionally devastating today. Yamada Hizashi, Present Mike, I agree with Nem. We have to let them come to us if we want to keep their trust. Usajiyama Rumi, Mirko, for now we should focus on helping them work through what they are feeling. They are still kids and probably don't know how to process what happened on their own. Arima Isamu, Snipe, I can take Izuku out to the range tomorrow. I think it'd help him clear his head a bit. Hopefully he'll open up a bit so we can figure out our next steps. Maijima Higuri, Power Loader, I'll make sure May and I get some father/daughter time in the support lab tomorrow. Ida Tensei, Ingenium Tenya has locked himself in his room, but I already have someone covering my patrol tomorrow so that I can spend some time with him. Yamada Hizashi, Present Mike Show and I are going to take Hitoshi to the cat cafe, if he's up for it. He's blasting music in his room so we don't hear him crying, sad face. Hakamada Tsunag, Best Genist, I know I am the newest member of our group, but I have grown to care for the children greatly. Please let me know if there is anything I can do. Midoriya Inko, I appreciate that, Tsunaga. Our kids have a strong support network around them, and I am hoping we can figure out what caused their argument sooner rather than later. Takami Keigo, Hawks, I am just getting off patrol, but I am headed over to your house, Mama Inko. Maybe just having us around will help? Nedzu, I may not be well versed in human emotion, but I see the children as family. I will be ready to assist at any point, please keep me updated. Aizawa Shota, Eraserhead, we're all going to make sure the kids are okay at the end of this. The days seem to blend together over the past 2 weeks, anything outside of training and school taking a back seat as Izuku tried to distract himself from the rift between him and his friends. He couldn't help but feel ashamed at how he had acted when Hitoshi tried to reason with him, but he wasn't sure how to remedy the situation. No one had mentioned his injuries to him, so he assumed that his friends kept the truth of his treatment at school a secret. He was thankful, but also felt guilty that they were loyal even after he had treated them so badly. He didn't deserve them, probably had never deserved them in the first place. The family believed in him, but at the end of the day he had forgotten what being a hero was truly about. After his falling out with Hitoshi, Izuku started paying attention to his surroundings at school. It made him realize just how many kids were getting bullied for their quirks at Aldra. He should do something, he had to do something, but he needed to formulate a plan before he went to his mom. His mind was swimming as the final bell rang and he collected his things, easily avoiding the group of bullies that were trying to follow him out of the building. Dabi had asked him to meet up at Mr. Kobayashi's cafe after school, a sign that his brother was trying to get him into a better mood. He was grateful that his brother's relationship with Keigo hadn't taken away from their time together, but he wasn't sure he was in the mood for Dabi's knowing looks. He could see right through Izuku, no matter how much he tried to put on a brave face. Still, Izuku didn't have the heart to say no to one-on-one time with his older brother. He dutifully began his journey to the cafe, ignoring the pang in his chest when he recollected the many afternoons spent with his trio of friends. There was a part of him that wondered if they still spent time there without him, but he didn't let himself ruminate on that thought for too long. He was distracted, barely registering the sound of someone calling out behind him until a familiar spiky blonde hairstyle came into his peripheral. "Are you deaf, nerd?" Bakugo huffed as he kept pace next to him. His mind immediately filled with rage, which he quickly got under control before he did anything too drastic. "What do you want?" He grunted, not in the mood to deal with Bakugo at the moment. The blonde hadn't bothered him too badly over the past few years, but they weren't friends either. He wasn't someone Izuku wanted to associate with, especially since he still hung around the bullies that terrorized people based off of their powers. Being a bystander was worse than almost anything, even though he felt like a hypocrite saying that now. "You've been acting all weird and mopey," Bakugo replied, his words more of a statement than a question. Izuku was left to puzzle out the intention behind those words, but his mind was too exhausted to play whatever game this was. "And how does that concern you?" he responded, not willing to give his ex-childhood friend the satisfaction of a cordial response. Instead of the anger Izuku was expecting, the blonde took his attitude in stride. He didn't respond to the question, choosing to walk in silence for a bit before speaking up again. "Nothing is wrong with Auntie, right?" Bakugo asked, his eyes landing everywhere else except Izuku's own gaze. Izuku couldn't help but stop as he processed the question, taking in the genuine concern in those red eyes. "She's fine," he answered truthfully, trying to ignore the sigh of relief that came from the blonde at the confirmation. He thought Bakugo would leave after confirming Inko was okay, but was surprised when the boy followed him the entire way to the cafe in silence. Izuku wasn't sure what was going on, but he wasn't feeling generous enough to invite his former friend inside to join him. He turned away wordlessly, only pausing once his hand was on the door. "Isn't your reputation going to suffer if anyone sees you talking to the useless Deku?" he asked, a bit of a bite in his voice as he awaited a response. If any of their classmates had seen them together, Bakugo probably would have made a show of acting like he was just messing with him. The blonde seemed to be full of surprises today. "Tsukauchi, I don't care what those idiots think." Bakugo shuffled awkwardly, his eyes darting around until they finally landed on the interior of the cafe. He stared inside for a few moments, his eyes contemplative as he seemed to think over what to say next. Instead, he threw Izuku a stiff nod and began walking home. The entire ordeal was too perplexing for Izuku's current mental state, so he decided to head into the cafe instead of thinking too hard about it. He would not give the universe the satisfaction of letting this get to him, especially after what happened with Hitoshi. There was a small part of him that wanted to accept the strange olive branch Bakugo had extended to him, but it was much more than he deserved at the moment. If even Bakugo was worried about him, how well was he really hiding his current state of distress? Mr. Kobayashi flashed him a kind smile as he finished wiping down the counter, and Izuku couldn't help but smile back. Something about this place always filled him with warmth, as though it was a safety net from the rest of the world. "I'm happy a certain someone finally got his head out of his ass," the man said, tipping his head towards the door before turning around to start working on Izuku's drink. "Me too," Izuku said as he settled into one of the nearby booths. He pulled out the most recent book he had borrowed from Nedzu, content on reading as he waited for Dabi. "I haven't seen you in a while, everything okay?" Mr. Kobayashi asked as he settled Izuku's bubble tea and a small plate of cookies down on the table. His eyes were shining with worry, but Izuku wasn't sure how to respond to the question. "Oh yeah, I've just been really busy with school and training lately." He lied, his forced smile grating on him as he tried to remain convincing. The cafe owner nodded and walked back to the counter, but it was clear that he didn't actually believe Izuku's lie. His phone buzzed from his pocket, giving him something to distract himself from his guilt. Dabi, hey kiddo, I am going to be a little late. Got stuck doing more paperwork than usual today. Sad face. Izuku, no worries. I'm here reading my book. Smiley face. He was a little grateful for the extra time he would get for reading, but his plans were interrupted when Mr. Kobayashi slid into the seat in front of him with his own cup of coffee. I've known you since you were a little tyke kid, he says, taking a sip from his mug and raising one of his eyebrows at Izuku. I know. He responded quietly, staring intently at the plate of cookies instead of gazing back up. Listen, if you don't want to talk about it, I won't bother you. But if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Mr. Kobayashi began to stand, but Izuku spoke up before he could stop himself. What do you think makes a good hero? The man sat back down, thinking over his response before nodding and looking back up at Izuku. A good hero helps anyone that needs it, no matter who they are. Mr. Kobayashi responded, his answer making Izuku's mind whir with questions. Even if they are a villain? He asked in confusion. Especially if they're a villain. The cafe owner responded, which was met by another confused look from Izuku. Kid, villains don't spring up out of nowhere. Mr. Kobayashi explained, taking a sip of his coffee. Before continuing, villains aren't born that way, they are made into what they are. Anyone could be turned into a villain under the right circumstances. The man's face flashed with pain for a moment before he continued his explanation. Sometimes all it takes to save them is someone reaching out when they need it most. Izuku's stomach clenched, thinking of the first night he met Dabi and brought him home. Of the nights listening to his brother have night terrors, reliving things that no one should have to go through. How he still flinched sometimes, like he was waiting to be hit at any moment. He thought of the light that was missing from Dabi's eyes that night, how he was surprised that anyone would show him kindness without expecting anything in return. Would anyone else have reached out to a kid trying to steal medical supplies? Or would they have looked the other way? He shivered as he thought of what his brother might have become if he was left to fester in his anger, alone and hungry on the streets. What type of people would have reached out their hands if they found him first? But most heroes would say to just arrest them and let the law handle it, right? Izuku asked, his mind still trying to soak in what he was hearing. No hero is perfect. Mr. Kobayashi responded, staring intently into his coffee. For the first time in his life, Izuku realized how tired the man's eyes were. It was as though he were looking into a window that reflected his entire life, a life filled with loss and pain. How well did he really know the cafe owner? His thoughts returned to his statement, but he thought of all the heroes he knew. They were as close to perfection as they could get. They have to be a little perfect, don't they? He wasn't naive enough to believe all pro-heroes were amazing people, but real heroes were supposed to be a bastion of good values. That's where you're wrong, kid. Mr. Kobayashi smiled warmly, his eyes sparkling like he was about to share a special secret. Izuku couldn't help but lean forward a bit, hungry for whatever information he was about to hear. A hero is someone who sees a person in need and helps them. It seems like you've done that plenty of times, right? The man had a knowing smile, and Izuku blushed as he recalled his various rescues over the years. Before he could respond, though, the door slammed open as a group of sketchy-looking men entered. Mr. Kobayashi put his mug down slowly, keeping his eyes on the group as he stood and walked back to the counter with a bright smile on his face. Izuku could see the tension behind his eyes, which immediately put him on high alert. What can I get for you today? Mr. Kobayashi asked, still wearing that tense smile. One of the men raised his arm, which quickly morphed into a sharp sword. Give us all of the money in the drawer, old man. The rest of the group activated their quirks as well, and Izuku's mind began racing as he tried to figure out how to protect Mr. Kobayashi from the thieves. He began to stand, but the cafe owner held up his hand and shook his head before opening up the drawer. All right, I don't want any problems, Mr. Kobayashi said as he began passing over the cash calmly. Once the register was empty, the robbers turned to leave, clearly content now that they had their money. Izuku let out a sigh of relief, happy that the entire incident went over without any violence. He realized he spoke too soon as one of the men eyed him with interest. You know, there's a doctor paying a lot of money for young people on the black market. He began to take a few steps towards Izuku, the rest of the group following closely behind. Their creepy grins put Izuku on edge, and he began calculating how he could escape this situation. His panicked gaze fell on Mr. Kobayashi, whose face was filled with thinly veiled rage. "Leave the boy alone, you've gotten what you came for." He spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Shut up, old man. We're taking this brat with us," one of the men said as he reached towards Izuku. The metal tip jar that sat on the counter was suddenly flung in the air, coins and bills fluttering throughout the cafe as the jar hit the man in the head. He crumpled to the ground, clutching the spot where the projectile had made contact. "What the dash?" one of the robbers began, but Mr. Kobayashi had already jumped over the counter and tackled him before he got the chance to finish. Izuku could only watch in awe as the cafe owner began fighting off each robber, his punches and kicks quickly taking down half the group. He was distracted by the man with the sword quirk when one of the downed robbers began to sneak up on him. "Mr. Kobayashi!" Izuku yelled before running towards the fight, using his speed to launch himself towards the attacker. The man fell to the ground, slamming his head against one of the chairs and collapsing. The man with the sword quirk was the last one standing, his eyes darting between Izuku and Mr. Kobayashi nervously. He probably didn't expect the middle schooler and cafe owner to put up such a fight, clearly biting off more than he could chew. The man seemed to think Izuku was the easier target, launching himself at the boy with both of his arms stretched out to stab him. Izuku immediately took a defensive stance, analyzing the trajectory and planning out his counterattack. Mr. Kobayashi appeared behind the robber, swinging a chair and hitting him across the head in a brutal show of strength. The man crumpled to the floor, but his outstretched arm pierced through the cafe owner's calf before he could react. Mr. Kobayashi fell to the floor, clutching his leg with a pained expression as he began to bleed. Izuku quickly pulled his phone out of his pocket, calling the emergency line as his eyes scanned the room for a first aid kit. He explained what happened to the phone operator, who assured him that an ambulance and a few police cars would be there within minutes. Izuku didn't even hear the door open behind him as he knelt next to Mr. Kobayashi, looking over his wound to assess the damage. "Izuku!" His brother's voice yelled out behind him, and he turned to see Dabi looking over the scene in shock. "Dabi, we need your first aid kit." Izuku waved his brother over, pointing at Mr. Kobayashi's skewered leg. Dabi immediately jumped into hero mode, pulling out his first aid kit from his bag as he began to work on the wound. Izuku grabbed any additional supplies his brother asked for as they waited for the ambulance. "I'll be okay, kids. I've dealt with much worse than this." The man chuckled as Izuku and Dabi fretted over him. "I guess owning a cafe is more dangerous than I thought." Dabi joked, clearly trying to lighten the mood as they tried to stop the bleeding. They had just gotten the bleeding under control when the door opened, a group of paramedics and police officers entering the cafe in droves. "Over here," Dabi called, guiding the paramedics to where Mr. Kobayashi and Izuku were. They quickly got to work, loading the man onto a stretcher and preparing themselves to take him to the ambulance. "Hold on a second," one of the cops, a man with a bird mutation quirk, said as he held his hand up. Izuku couldn't imagine why they were stopping, especially when Mr. Kobayashi was getting paler by the moment. "You two took these criminals down all by yourselves?" The man gestured to the robbers that were currently being handcuffed by the rest of the officers. "Yes," Izuku replied, his eyes darting to the stretcher once again, wishing they could head to the hospital. "Peretti. Well then, I need to see your quirk registration cards. What you two did could be considered vigilantism." The man held out his hand expectantly, and Izuku's vision immediately clouded with rage. "Vigilantism? Were we supposed to let them kill us?" His voice cracked as he tried to control himself. Dabi was shaking with anger a few feet away, stomping forward as he pulled out his hero license. "You can't be a vigilante if you're quirkless." Mr. Kobayashi wheezed out, and Izuku initially thought the man was only trying to save him from the possible repercussions of their actions. "Which one of you is quirkless?" the cop asked, disgust evident in his tone as he glanced between the two of them. Izuku's stomach felt sour, discouraged from seeing quirk discrimination play out right in front of him. Both of us. The man replied, crying out in pain as his leg began to twitch. Izuku only had a moment to process the meaning behind that statement before his arms were being thrown behind his back by the officer questioning them. You expect me to believe 2 quirkless took these thieves down? I will arrest you both for lying to a police officer. Izuku cried out in pain as his wrists were forced into cuffs. If you want to play that game, I am officially taking control over this crime scene. Let my little brother out of those cuffs, now. Dabi growled as he flashed his license around and ordered the paramedics to load the ambulance up. Azure, I didn't realize it was you, sir. My apologies. The officer shook as he uncuffed Izuku, bowing apologetically and stepping away from the boy. Yeah, you will be sorry when I explain what just happened to our mother. Dabi sent the cop a glare before turning to Izuku and pointing to the ambulance. Get on the ambulance, your face is bleeding. He demanded, and Izuku immediately followed his instructions. He and Dabi stayed out of the way as the paramedics worked to further stabilize Mr. Kobayashi before they reached the hospital. The cafe owner was immediately taken to one of the operating rooms while Izuku was placed in a room near the entrance of the ER. A kind nurse took care of his small scratches and bruises, instructing him to take it easy for a few days. She gave him a concerned look when she saw the yellowing bruises underneath his shirt, but he told her that they came from training. As soon as she stepped out of the room, the officer from earlier stepped inside. Izuku felt a bit panicked at the sight of the man, as Dabi had stepped out to grab them something to eat and check on Mr. Kobayashi's condition. I need to ask you a few questions, the officer said, making himself comfortable on one of the chairs before pulling out his notepad. Okay. Izuku responded, not wanting to cause any more trouble for himself or his family. Who really took those robbers down? He asked, staring up at Izuku from behind his notepad. We already told you, it was Mr. Kobayashi and I. Izuku responded, a bit annoyed that he had to repeat himself again. You really expect me to believe that 2 quirkless fought off a group of robbers? The officer asked in a mocking tone. Just because we're quirkless doesn't mean that we are helpless. Izuku puffed out his chest, unwilling to let this man make him feel small. Maybe you're not helpless, but your kind is completely useless to society. The cop stood, striding towards Izuku before towering over him where he sat. Before Izuku could respond, the curtain was moved to the side, and a man in a tan coat and hat stepped into the room. He smiled warmly at Izuku before turning to the officer with a frown. You know, quirk discrimination has some really nasty penalties for police officers. The mystery man said, and Izuku watched as the officer began to shake where he stood. Detective Tsukauchi, sir. I didn't realize you were on this case. The officer said as he backed away slowly from Izuku. An old pro-hero friend reached out to me, asking me to come check on his nephew while he made his way to the hospital. The knowledge that this man knew someone in his family immediately calmed him down. And nephew? The officer looked like he was about to burst with anxiety at the prospect of not only pissing off 1 pro-hero, but 2. If only he knew how many people would be coming for his badge once they found out what had happened. Why don't we step outside so you can debrief me on your conversation with Mr. Midoriya? The detective held the curtain open, and the officer took shaking steps as he made his way out of the room. For the next 15 minutes Izuku listened as Tsukauchi tore the officer apart, sprinkling in phrases such as abuse of power and completely irresponsible as he scolded the officer for his behavior. The man was left with a final, I'll have your badge, before Tsukauchi returned to Izuku's room. Hello, Mr. Midoriya. My name is Detective Tsukauchi. I'm an old friend of Eraserhead. The detective held his hand out with a small smile, and Izuku immediately shook it. Nice to meet you. Izuku responded, still unsure about how he should act around the detective. I apologize if you heard my conversation with Officer Sugimoto, but I couldn't let him think that type of behavior was acceptable. Tsukauchi made himself comfortable in one of the seats, clearly planning on waiting until Izuku's family got there. It made him feel more at ease, knowing that the detective would stop anyone else from bothering him. Thank you, it's nice to know someone in the force is willing to stick up for quirkless people. Izuku was sad that there were people out there that hated quirkless people so much, but it was nice to know people like his family and Tsukauchi existed. He couldn't help but think that the tired-looking detective would make a great addition to the family. Well, we have to look out for each other. The detective replied with a sad smile, and it took Izuku a moment to realize what he meant. Wait, you're quirkless? Izuku asked, his eyes wide as Tsukauchi nodded. As quirkless as they come. The detective replied. Izuku couldn't believe that he now had two quirkless adults in his life, especially people like Detective Tsukauchi and Mr. Kobayashi. They didn't seem ostracized by society and were important members in their community. It gave him a bit of hope that he could actually achieve his dreams, that he could make a difference in the lives of quirkless people. Encouragement was great, but seeing quirkless adults living their lives changed his entire perspective on things. Before they could continue their conversation, Dabi entered the room with 2 trays of food and a few bags of snacks. His older brother immediately tensed when he saw the detective, carefully placing their food down on a table and then standing in between Izuku and the stranger. Can I help you? Dabi had his arms crossed, his intimidating gaze shooting daggers in the man's direction. Dabi, he's friends with Uncle Sho. He's also quirkless. Izuku exclaimed, and he knew his eyes were probably sparkling with joy at the moment. Dabi immediately softened, but he still seemed to be keeping an eye on the detective. My name is Tsukauchi Naomasa. I'm a detective and a friend of Aizawa. He reached out to shake Dabi's hand, and the hero shook it cautiously. Tsukauchi explained the debacle with Officer Sugimoto, which led to Dabi apologizing profusely for leaving Izuku alone. The younger boy waved his concerns off, more worried about Mr. Kobayashi's condition. He's okay, there wasn't any serious damage. There's a healing quirk on him and recommended that he rest for a few days before returning to work. Dabi explained as they ate. The taste of the hospital cafeteria katsudon made Izuku want to go home even more than before. Where is my son? Inko's voice rang through the hall, and Dabi immediately jumped up to find her. Their mother could be terrifying when she was angry, and the brothers really didn't want her to let that anger loose on the nurses and doctors in the emergency room. A few moments later she entered the room with Aizawa and Mike right behind her, the trio immediately fretting over Izuku and his small injuries. Once they had checked him over and saw that he wasn't mortally wounded, she turned to the detective. And you are? His mother's calculating gaze scanned over the detective, clearly deciding if the man was a threat or not. Detective Tsukauchi Naomasa, I'm a friend of Aizawa's and I'm taking over this case due to my fellow officers mismanaging it. Tsukauchi's eyes seemed fearful as he tentatively reached out a hand towards Inko. The woman shook it, her eyes still filled with suspicion as she turned towards Shota to confirm the information. Tsukauchi is the friend I called to come check on Izuku. I can vouch for him and his trustworthiness. Shota seemed amused by how terrified the cop was of Inko. Izuku, how is Mr. Kobayashi doing? Zashi sat next to him on the bed, giving him a bit of space due to his injuries. Dabi and Izuku began explaining what happened, and Detective Tsukauchi got permission from Inko to take notes and ask questions for his report. Aizawa and Mike shared a concerned glance when they heard about the doctor offering money for young people, but they seemed content on asking more questions later. As Izuku and Dabi explained how they were treated by the officers, the adults seemed to fill with rage. I expect the officers in question will be dealt with? Inko turned to the detective with a raised brow, and the man nodded with a nervous smile. I promise I will do everything in my power to make sure they are punished for this behavior. Tsukauchi responded, and Izuku believed him. It was nice to be able to trust another adult, and it only solidified the idea that he wanted to get to know the detective better. There were so many skills he could learn from an officer, and something about the man seemed lonely. The group talked for another half hour or so, until one of the nurses came in with Izuku's discharge papers. They said goodbye to the detective, but not before Inko could grab the man's phone number. Izuku expected that he would be added to the chat soon, perhaps once Shota gave him a thorough warning about the chaos he might witness. Izuku was happy to be home after such a long day, taking a shower and carefully redressing his bandages. His mom told him that he would be staying home from school the rest of the week, and he was silently grateful for the break. He didn't want anyone to injure him even further, as that would mean less time for training. He fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow, His last thoughts were of Mr. Kobayashi effortlessly taking down a group of villains. Nakaguro. Shota liked to consider himself an observant man, and his memory had only improved over years of underground hero work. He remembered the name and face of every villain he had ever taken down, of every student he had ever watched graduate, and especially the students he had lost to the field of heroics. He also remembered every vigilante he had ever come across, especially the ones that fought by his side over the years. One name always stuck out amongst all of them, the man that Shota owed his life to. Kibo. The vigilante had disappeared years ago, before Shota had even met Izuku or the group of people he now considered a family. The man was extremely honorable. His mission was to help villains get back on the right path. He had taught Shota so much about the world, how the lines between hero and villain weren't as simple as society made them seem. Kibo saw the good in people, but it was never rooted in naivety. He would take down those that were too far gone, never hesitating to do what needed to be done. He had become Shota's unofficial patrol partner for most of his early career, the two of them sharing cups of coffee and talking about their lives. Kibo was secretive about his identity, but he still talked about growing up in society as a quirkless kid with dreams of being a hero. It was one of the many reasons Shota had insisted on being so involved in Izuku's life and his training, a reminder of the mentor that shaped the hero Shota was today. They had set up a routine, always meeting on the roof of their favorite convenience store before getting started for the night. Until one day, the vigilante didn't show up. It was a few weeks after a raid that went sideways, one where Shota almost didn't make it out alive. He had been pinned underneath a few pieces of rubble as the building went up in flames, fully believing he would die until a familiar figure emerged nearby. Kibo had dug him out and carried him to the paramedics, disappearing before anyone could stop him. It was the last time Shota had seen the man, his only communication after that being a letter with no return address. Kibo explained that it was time for him to step back, that he had lost someone dear to him and didn't see the point of fighting anymore. The end of the letter said that he hoped Shota would find him one day, and that he'd be sure to get him a cup of coffee when they reunited. He found himself subconsciously looking for Kibo, trying to find the mentor and friend that had molded him and his ideals in so many ways. Kibo and Izuku would get along so well, Shota always thought to himself. He had never told Izuku or even Hitoshi about the man, content on keeping it a secret until he felt it was necessary. At least, that was his plan before he met the kind cafe owner known as Mr. Kobayashi. When the man handed him his coffee order, exactly the way he had been drinking it for years, he couldn't help but be suspicious. Shota had stayed away from the cafe, not willing to confront the man he thought to be Kibo just yet, unable to believe that his search had finally come to an end. When Izuku told them about how Mr. Kobayashi effortlessly took down the robbers almost completely by himself, how he had told his nephew to reach out a hand to everyone that needed it, that was the confirmation Shota needed to finally confirm his suspicions. As they rode the hospital elevator up a few floors, he readied himself for what could be an emotional reunion. The anticipation was killing him as he listened to Izuku and Inko quietly chat about raising money for the man while he was on bedrest. They got off the elevator and made their way to the room, but Shota couldn't help but pause for a moment outside of the door. "Are you okay, Sho?" Mike asked, concern evident in his eyes as he glanced between the door and his husband. "I'm fine," he responded, giving the blonde a small smile before knocking on the door. "Come in." A voice rang out, and Shota allowed himself to really listen to it for the first time. All of his doubts about Mr. Kobayashi's identity were thrown out the window as he opened the door and stepped into the room. "Did you finally figure it out, kid?" the man asked from the bed, smiling as Shota gave him a tearful nod. Inko, Mike, and Izuku watched in confusion as Shota strided over to the bed and wrapped Mr. Kobayashi into a soft hug. "I'm happy you survived. Out there without me, son." Mr. Kobayashi spoke quietly, his own eyes filled with tears. Shota felt elated when he heard the old term of affection, the one that made him forget his strained relationship with his parents as he patrolled the streets with the man in front of him. "I had a somewhat decent teacher." Shota laughed as they pulled apart. Mr. Kobayashi glanced behind him, and he realized he had a lot of explaining to do. "Everyone, this is Kibo." Shota gestured towards the man, and Mick's eyes immediately lit up in recognition. The rest of the afternoon was spent drinking coffee and filling his family in on his past with the vigilante. Kibo, or Aki as the man insisted on being called, told them about what he had been up to since he left his alter ego behind. Shota watched as Izuku asked questions about his fighting style and what it was like to be quirkless while he was growing up. It was wonderful that two of the most important people in his life could bond like this, and he knew that Aki would be a great addition to their family. He was excited for the man to meet Hitoshi one day, hopefully once his son and nephew were on better terms again. He felt warm all over, like a puzzle piece he was missing had finally returned to its rightful place. It reminded him how wonderful family could be, and how it wasn't limited to the people you shared your DNA with. Family is the people that find you, who see you for who you are and decide that they love all the parts. Those that choose to be in your life, not based on obligation but out of pure love and trust. There was nothing more beautiful than finding your people, feeling embraced for the first time in your life. What a beautiful thing it was. Nakaguro. Chat. Midoriya Izuku Ida Tenya, Shinso hit. Izuku, I know I'm the last person you all want to hear from, but I think I'm starting to remember what being a hero really means. Izuku, I'll let you know when I've figured it out. Hitoshi, we'll be waiting. The final bell of the day had just rung, signaling the end to Izuku's hellish school day and the start of his freedom for the rest of the afternoon. He quickly gathered his things while keeping his eyes down low. If he made eye contact with any of his bolder classmates, he wouldn't be able to leave for another half hour or so. He had just made it out the door when a fist collided with his stomach, knocking him off balance and causing him to fall to his knees. An elbow flew through the air, hitting him directly in the nose before he had time to stop it. Izuku cursed his sluggish reflexes, reminding himself once again that he could never let his guard down around his peers. A few drops of blood fell from his nose onto the ground. Watch where you're going, Deku. One of the second years sneered, laughing with his friends as they patted him on the back for beating up the resident quirkless kid. Izuku waited for the group to walk down the hall before slowly standing up and brushing his pants off. He held his nose to help control the bleed as he walked to the nearest bathroom. Today was one of his training days with Rumi, and he couldn't afford a bruise on his face. He inspected his bleeding nose in the mirror, breathing out a sigh of relief when he didn't see any noticeable bruising. After a few quick dabs from a wet paper towel, there was no sign that the injury ever existed. As he was readying himself to leave, the door to the bathroom opened, causing him to immediately tense. He hoped his classmates weren't there to finish the job. He couldn't afford any more injuries from his bullies. Izuku risked glancing behind himself in the mirror, furrowing his eyebrows in confusion when he saw Bakugo leaning against the wall casually. Why don't you ever fight back? You and I both know you could kick their asses if you wanted to. Bakugo scowled at him through the reflection, his eyes briefly darting to his nose for a moment before kicking off the wall. That wouldn't be very heroic, would it? Izuku tried to sound annoyed, but his voice sounded tired as he finished cleaning the dried blood off his upper lip. At least you wouldn't be getting your ass kicked every day. Bakugo was staring at a random spot in the corner with his arms crossed as he spoke, avoiding Izuku's eyes. If I want to be the first quirkless hero in Japan, then I will need to have really thick skin. Izuku reasoned, not quite sure why he was still entertaining this conversation. Tisich, that's some fucked up logic. Bakugo grunted, and Izuku could only scoff. The blonde had followed him halfway home every day since the walk to the cafe, staying silent but still walking by his side. It was all a farce, some strange way for the other boy to work out his guilt and pity towards him. It was really starting to piss him off. Why are you pretending to care? He turned towards Bakugo, his eyes fixed into a fierce glare as he bared his teeth. Being pitted was so exhausting, he'd much rather go back to the time when Bakugo was just a bit afraid of him. Bakugo stood there, frozen in place with wide eyes as he tried to figure out how to respond to Izuku's question and change of demeanor. His shocked expression eventually morphed into a scowl, which felt like familiar territory for the pair. Whatever. The blonde huffed, walking to the door before pausing and stuffing his hands in his pocket. Don't get your ass killed, I still need to beat you at UA. Bakugo walked out the door before Izuku could process what he said, leaving the greenette standing in the middle of the bathroom with a puzzled expression. Some long-forgotten part of Izuku knew the other boy was trying to reach out, even if it was in his own complicated and egotistical way. But Izuku truly didn't have the capacity to take on Bakugo's emotional baggage at the moment. He had far too much of his own to deal with first. Was there a future where the two of them could be friends again? Is that even what Bakugo wanted? He would have to table these thoughts until he figured out what he was going to do about Aldra, which was his biggest priority at the moment. The apology he owed his friends had been weighing on him, and he couldn't wait to show them how sorry he truly was. Izuku left the bathroom, happy to find that no one was waiting for him as he finally left the school building. His stomach was still sore from being punched, but he didn't have time to focus on it. In 2 hours he would be meeting up with Rumi for training, and he couldn't afford for his older sister to get suspicious before he finalized his plans for Aldra. The walk home was quick, even though he had slowly grown used to his unwanted companion. He breathed a sigh of relief when he saw his house in the distance, already imagining the hot bath he would take before he had to leave for training. Keigo and Dabi were on the couch watching an action movie, but they paused it to greet him. "How was your day, little bird?" Keigo asked, his arms slung casually around Dabi's shoulder. "It was fine. I'm really looking forward to training though." Izuku lied. "You're always working so hard, Squirt. I hope you're still giving yourself time to be a kid." Dabi was looking at him with concern written across his face, but Izuku shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Keigo must have sensed his discomfort, effortlessly changing the subject before things could get too awkward. "Inko stepped out for an emergency client meeting, but she should be back before you have to leave." Izuku nodded and thanked him for letting him know, giving them both a small wave and smile before heading up to his room. He missed the matching gazes that followed him, both young men unsure of how to help the boy that had rescued them. He took off his uniform shirt to assess the damage to his stomach, wincing as he catalogued the multicolored bruises littering his torso. Once again he cursed his conflicting emotions, not wanting to seem weak but desperately needing to rely on his support network for help. As he watched the bath fill up with water, he thought about his family, the people who cared for him so deeply and would do anything to help him. He knew they would burn the world down for him, but he still struggled to believe he deserved it. His mom had casually mentioned going to therapy, and he was sure it had something to do with his falling out with his friends. But some part of him still desperately wanted to believe there was nothing wrong with him, nothing broken to fix. He knew Dabi went to therapy, and he was pretty sure all the other heroes he knew did as well. There was no need for him to have such a stigma about it, but it was something he still needed to unlearn on his own time. Izuku lowered himself into the hot water, breathing out a sigh as his sore muscles began to relax a bit. He really needed to make more time for soaks, especially with how much he trained and worked out. If he weren't dealing with injuries from his bullies, he'd probably be making even more progress during his sessions with his mentors. He soaked in the tub for as long as possible, allowing his mind to empty and relax for the first time in a while. His eyes had drifted closed, his body half asleep as he wandered between dreams and reality. A soft knock on the bathroom door was the only thing that broke the spell, causing him to panic as he desperately tried to figure out what time it was. "Izuku, honey? Do you need a ride to training?" His mother's soft voice came from the other side of the door. Yes please. I'll be down shortly." He began to drain the tub and dry himself off, breathing out a sigh of relief when he saw that he had somehow only spent 20 minutes in the bath. Once he was changed, he headed back downstairs, preparing himself a small bowl of noodles to hold himself over until dinner. He joined Keigo and Dabi in the living room to watch the last half of the movie, allowing himself to relax and enjoy quality time with the pair. He couldn't help but reflect on how lucky he was to have his family, people who always wanted the best for him and were always willing to help. He wanted to be worthy of their unconditional love. It was time for him to be a real hero, someone that stands up for everyone. He promised himself that he would sit his mom down after school on Monday, giving him enough time to finalize all of his plans and to think of what he wanted to say to his friends. If only he knew that the universe never waited for you to be ready for these types of things. Nakaguro. Most people thought Rumi only cared about winning and fighting, but they were sorely mistaken. A little green-haired kid had dug his way through the walls surrounding her heart and made a home there, and then came the rest of the lovable idiots she called family. She always looked forward to spending one-on-one time with Izuku, especially since they were both so busy now. Climbing the ranks always had its perks, but she relished the time spent eating dinner with her family or taking the kids out to the arcade or amusement park. Perhaps she had gotten a little soft over the years. Sue her. When Izuku had a falling out with the rest of the kids, it had broken her heart, but none of the little brats would open up about what happened. She had a few suspicions, but she also didn't want to break their trust by pushing too hard. Pre-teens were finicky, and there was a finesse needed when dealing with them. Rumi had been stretching when Izuku walked into the gym, but something about his demeanor put him on edge. Ever since her little brother had started middle school, she had watched the shine slowly dim in his eyes. It broke her heart, and it made her want to show up at his school and burn it to the ground. "Hey, Izuku," she greeted, hopping up and running over to put him in a headlock and ruffle his hair. The surprised laugh that escaped him was W0 art, every bit of effort, and she hoped she could lighten even a fraction of the load the boy was holding on his shoulders. "Rumi, you're tickling me." He half-heartedly tried to push away, his eyes crinkling with laughter as her hand moved from his head to his armpit. Her casual prank quickly devolved into a full-fledged tickle war, the two siblings chasing each other around the gym trying to catch one another. She had just escaped Izuku's grasp, ready to make her escape until she heard a soft gasp of pain behind her. When she turned, her stomach dropped. The sight in front of her made her chest clench in panic. Her little brother was kneeling on the ground, clutching his side as he clenched his side stomach in pain. "Izuku, did I hurt you?" Her heart was hammering, her greatest fear realized right in front of her. She was always terrified that she would take it too far one day, that she would hurt her precious kid brother and lose everything she had grown to cherish. "I'm fine, Rumi." Izuku wheezed as she knelt beside him. "It was nothing you did," he finished, closing his eyes as he tried to control his breathing. Her hands clenched his wrists and pulled them away, and she had already lifted his shirt up to assess the damage by the time he had yelled, "Stop." Anxiety was replaced with cold rage as she saw the multitude of bruises littering Izuku's body, sickly shades of yellows and purples marring her little brother's torso. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice scarily calm as her eyes roamed the injuries. Izuku grabbed his shirt and pulled it down, scooting himself backward until there was a foot of distance between them. "Please, please don't tell anyone." The boy's eyes began to fill with tears as his hands rose to pull at his hair. "I promise I am going to tell my mom in a few days, I just need more time." He looked so desperate, and Rumi wasn't going to argue with him in this state. Instead, she crawled over to him and wrapped him in her arms. Her brother broke down in sobs as she clutched him to her chest, the bubbling anger in her stomach threatening to overtake her as she vowed to punish those that had hurt him. She hadn't promised Izuku that she wouldn't say anything, and she was more than willing to deal with his anger if it meant her brother would be safe. Nakaguro. The adults, plus Rumi, Tensei, Keigo and Dabi. "Rumi, Mirko, we need to do something about Izuku's school." Dabi, "Azure, I agree, Izuku hasn't been himself lately." Tensei, "Ingenium, I am ready to do whatever needs to be done, that school should have been shut down a long time ago." Nedzu, "I have been waiting for this opportunity for a long time," smiley face. Inko, "I have multiple folders dedicated to taking down that sad excuse for a school." Namuri, Midnight, "How can we handle this without losing Izuku's trust? That boy is extremely stubborn." Keigo, "Hawks, I don't want to upset Izuku more than necessary, but we also need to prioritize his safety and mental health. I'm not sure how to pursue this if I'm being honest." Emi, "Ms. Joke, perhaps some type of undercover operation. Gathering intel is an important first step to bringing any type of organization down." Hizashi, "Present Mike, you sound like show, but I completely agree. Perhaps we can figure out a way to scope the school out without raising too much suspicion?" Nao Mesa, "Detective Tsukauchi, I'd be happy to provide support on this op. I could team up with Aizawa, since we are the least recognizable out of the group." Tsunagu, "Best Jeanist, I will be working on my next fashion line next week. The designer's offices are only a few minutes away from Izuku's school." Isamu, "Snipe, we should all be on alert then. We don't know how the administration will lash out if they realize they are being investigated." Shota, "Aizawa, I think it's time that representatives of UA see exactly what type of heroic potential Aldera has to offer." Izuku quickened his pace as he walked down the empty hallway, frustrated that he had let himself sleep in this morning. He hadn't slept well the night before, constantly waking up in the middle of the night after nightmares that he couldn't quite remember. There was only a sense of panic and loss, an unexplainable loneliness hanging in the air as he stared up at the ceiling. He knew his homeroom teacher would think up some ridiculous punishment for him, but he couldn't find it in himself to care at this point. There was no way for him to control the actions of his teachers and peers, and he was tired of trying. If he wanted to reach his dreams, he would need to learn to take it, letting their insults and punishments roll off his back. Things never seemed that simple, no matter how many times he tried to reason with himself that it was possible. When he reached his classroom's door, he stepped in, not even acknowledging his teacher as he made his way to his desk. "Well, that was rather rude, Deku." A nasally voice called out with a mocking tone. Izuku looked up, shocked to find the principal of Aldera standing at the front of the room with one of the office administrators. His smile was deadly sweet, which put Izuku immediately on edge. "Sorry, sir." He bowed slightly, hoping that he could finally sit down and retain some sense of normalcy. "It is nice of you to finally show up. I actually wanted to have a little chat with you." Principal Watashi gestured for Izuku to follow him out of the room, much to the boy's frustration. There was no way this would be a pleasant talk for him, probably ending in detention or some other form of punishment for his supposed disciplinary issues or cheating. Some small part of Izuku secretly hoped that Rumi had told someone about the bruises, but he wouldn't let himself think that way. Being unrealistic had never really benefited him. They began their trek down the hallway, with both adults walking on either side of Izuku in complete silence. His senses were screaming that he was in danger, but he tried to keep himself calm. The adults at Aldera had always looked the other way when he was being bullied, but they had never done anything to actually hurt him before. He kept his guard up, but his eyes were on the ground while they ascended the staircase. "You know, it is rather strange that a quirkless child has perfect grades in all of his classes." The principal began, his dress shoes clacking against the steps as they continued to walk upward. "Yes, sir." The response had been ingrained into Izuku after so many meetings with his teachers and the head of the school. The administrator's heels clicked next to him, and Izuku vaguely recognized the woman as one of the secretaries in the front office. "When I see someone of lower cognitive potential getting better grades than our most promising students, I have to be a bit suspicious," Principal Watashi said, his voice oozing distaste. Izuku's vision flashed with rage before he calmed himself down, not wanting to give the situation any power over him. The man continued talking as Izuku zoned him out, choosing to focus on his shoes instead of whatever discriminatory nonsense was being thrown his way. It seemed they had finally reached their floor as a door opened in front of him, and he walked through the doorway unquestioningly so that he would not get in even more trouble. A slight breeze hit his face, causing Izuku to look up and realize they were on the roof. Suddenly he was shoved forward, successfully tucking and rolling so that he didn't get injured as he fell to the ground. He looked behind him in shock, hoping that this was some sick misunderstanding or practical joke. The unfeeling expressions on both adults' faces confirmed his worst fear. This was actually happening to him. He jumped up, trying to run back towards the door until a sticky substance formed underneath his feet. The receptionist was holding her hands in front of her, clearly using her quirk to prevent his escape. "Over. We have a few distinguished guests visiting today, and I want them to only see the absolute best the school has to offer." The door closed as the principal finished his spiel, leaving Izuku completely alone on the roof of his school. He tried to claw the door open, cursing himself for leaving his bag in his locker that day. His teachers had been confiscating his things, and he didn't want any more of his inventions to be stolen away from him or broken. His efforts to open the door were unsuccessful, but he continued trying to pull it open until his hands began to bleed. He tried to follow his training. Staying calm in an emergency was an important part of being a hero. Izuku looked around the roof, trying to locate anything that would help him pry the door open. When that didn't work, he walked to the edge, cursing when he found a barrier that kept you from seeing over the edge. He wouldn't be able to call for help that way, and he wasn't sure anyone would be able to hear him from all the way up here. Panic began to overwhelm him, but he tried to stay calm and practiced the meditation techniques that Shota and Nedzu had taught him. He sat down in the center of the roof, focusing his mind even though his anxiety was soaring. He visualized his phone, which was sitting on top of his book bag in his locker with the rest of his things. If only he had it on him, but he had gotten tired of it being taken out of his pocket by the teachers and students. His heart was pounding in his chest as the seconds went by, trying to convince himself that someone would find him any minute. Sure, someone would care that he was missing from class, right? Why would they care about a Deku? A voice inside his head taunted, but he tried to keep his hopes up. Time continued to pass, and the overwhelming fear that he would never be found took over any rational thoughts as his eyes bore invisible holes into the door. He thought of his family, wondering if they would come looking for him, or would they be happy to be rid of him finally. No more quirkless runt to look after, they could finally focus on the 3 kids that actually had quirks and potential. Tears were pouring down his face as he cursed his inability to control his negative thoughts and anxiety in a crisis like this. How would he ever become a pro if this was how he was acting? He began fidgeting with the metal bracelet he wore every day, a Christmas gift from Nedzu that he would cherish forever. His eyes widened, his gaze shifting back down to the accessory as he remembered something the stoat had said after fastening it to his wrist. If you're ever in trouble, press your fingers to these 2 beads for 3 seconds, then press the bead in the middle. Was this an emergency worth using the bracelet? Would he just be bothering Nedzu if he sent out a panic alert? Izuku silenced the voices in his head, using the brief clarity to follow the instructions his mentor had given him. Once he pressed the middle bead, the bracelet began to flash red before emitting a series of beeps, clearly sending out a signal of some sort. He couldn't help but sob in relief, hoping that his family would be able to find him on the cold rooftop. Nakaguro, Nakaguro. Shota fidgeted with the keys in his pocket as he and Tsukauchi walked the halls of Aldra Middle School. The moment they had approached the building, something just seemed off, like there was a negative energy radiating from the school. They were posing as representatives from UA that were sent to look for children with heroic quirks, whatever the hell that meant. His stomach twisted as he thought about the quirkest implication of that language, and how the principal had readily accepted their request. Any educator worth a damn would have questioned their intentions, but they were allowed to visit the school with little resistance. The principal was leading them around, droning on about the potential of their students and boldly bragging about illegal quirk training on school grounds. They were introduced to a few of the students, who were all instructed to demonstrate their quirks for the visitors. Shota was ready to shut down the school based on that alone, but he wanted to gather more evidence to ensure that their case was rock solid. He and Tsukauchi were wearing mics and body cameras, capturing everything they saw and heard that day. The pair had specifically requested to see Izuku's homeroom, giving the excuse that they had been scouting a few students in the class and wanted to meet them in person. It was frankly pathetic how gullible the administration at the school was, as they readily agreed to the strange request. It seemed they were much more worried about the school's reputation than the safety of the children. Shota wondered how his nephew would react when they walked through the door, but he hoped Izuku wouldn't be too mad at them. They followed the principal into the classroom, and both men scanned the classroom for the familiar head of curly green hair. Shota and Tsukauchi locked eyes when they saw that Izuku's chair was empty, but they both seemed to silently agree that the kid could just be in the bathroom or something. That was until he noticed the Bakugu kid glancing between them and the empty seat with a mix of emotions in his eyes. I will have each student introduce themselves and their quirks. I'm sure you will agree that this class is one filled with heroic potential. The principal grinned, clearly unbothered by the empty seat. It seems you are missing a student. Tsukauchi casually gestured towards Izuku's desk, and Shota watched as the teacher and principal shifted for a moment before smiling brightly at their visitors. Ah yes, we actually had a vacancy this year. The teacher lied through his teeth, and the alarm bell started going off in Shota's head. If Izuku had simply stepped out for a bathroom break, there would be no reason for them to lie like this. He clenched his fist, and he could sense Tsukauchi tensing next to him. When we reviewed the class registry, there was another child, I believe his name was Midoriya? Shota tried to keep up his fake persona, but his concern for his nephew was threatening to take over. That name doesn't sound familiar. Perhaps we can start introducing you to the students here? The principal tried to change the subject, but Shota wouldn't let him. Before he could press the man again, a surprising voice spoke up first. They took Deku away at the beginning of class and then returned without him. Don't let them lie to you. Bakugo grunted as he pointed to the principal and teacher. Shota froze for a moment as he processed that Deku was Izuku, and that something was very wrong here. He couldn't fully acknowledge that Izuku's former bully and childhood friend was speaking up for his nephew's safety. That would have to wait until they found the boy. Where is the kid? Shota dropped all niceties from his tone and began walking over to the two men, but a loud alarm began ringing through the room. He realized it was emitting from both his and Tsukauchi's phones, and the two men shared a confused look before pulling the devices out. Izuku, panic button activated. His heart dropped, remembering the device that Netsu had given the kid a while back. He stood frozen, unable to move as his mind raced with ways to find his nephew. Aizawa. Tsukauchi placed a hand on his shoulder, breaking him out of his panicked spell. It was time for him to be a hero, to put Uncle Sho aside and to bring Eraserhead to the forefront. He turned to the teacher, hoping the man had some type of connection with Izuku after teaching him for months. Where did they take Midoriya Izuku? Shota asked calmly, trying to control his emotions before they overwhelmed him. This all seems like a misunderstanding. Clearly Bakugo wants a bit of attention from our UA visitors. The principal spoke up, trying to step in between the pro-hero and the homeroom teacher. Shota shot a strand of his capture weapon out and wrapped the annoying man up, having grown tired of his constant lies. Tsukauchi, text the group to let them know what is going on here. He instructed his friend, knowing that the family would be freaking out after receiving the alert. Most of them were on standby in case anything went down, but it'd be best for them to know what was going on before they jumped into action. How dare you? Put the principal down now. The teacher began pulling at Shota's capture scarf, but it wouldn't budge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his hero license, flashing the room so that they could see he was a pro. My name is Eraserhead. I am an underground hero and teacher at UA. This is Detective Tsukauchi. He gestured towards his friend, who was flashing his own badge to the class. This is now an investigation into a missing child. No one leaves this school until we find Izuku. Shota put the principal down in one of the chairs and watched as Tsukauchi cuffed him. Hopefully that would show them all how serious they were about finding his nephew. It was clear that the students were a bit confused by his use of Izuku's first name, but he couldn't find it in himself to care at the moment. We have officers on their way to lock down the school, and the family is making their way here now. Tsukauchi updated him, and Shota let out a small sigh in relief. He knew that they all wouldn't rest until the kid was safe, and that this school would burn to the ground before the day was done. I'll take care of things here. You can help set up a barrier around the school once the cops arrive. Shota instructed before turning back to the principal and kneeling to his level. He activated his quirk, letting his red eyes and floating hair do all the work as he tried to intimidate the sleazeball in front of him. I will only ask you one more time, where is Izuku? He practically growled at the man, but he was quickly losing his temper. I don't know why you two are so concerned for such a useless child. The principal yelled in frustration, and the room got eerily silent as Shota yanked the man forward by his tie. That useless kid is my nephew, and if he is hurt in any way I will make you pay. Shota was mere inches from the man's face, having to fight the urge to headbutt him as he backed away slowly. Gasps of shock rang through the room at his statement, and he once again had to remind himself that he was in a room full of kids. They might be misguided, but he didn't want to traumatize a room full of 12-year-olds. The teacher was now trembling in fear, and Shota couldn't help but be pleased as he watched the principal pale as he realized just how much trouble he was in. Tsukauchi was about to walk out of the room when the door burst open, and the angry faces of pro-heroes Mirko and Azure were revealed to the room. Thanks for the directions, Couchman. Rumi grunted as she walked past, and the detective simply shook his head as he left the classroom to find his officers. Dabi was practically shaking with rage, and Shota made a mental note too. Keep an eye on the young hero. He had always been extremely protective over Izuku, but now wasn't the time to let their emotions go wild. This is the principal. According to one of the students, he took Izuku out of the classroom at the beginning of the period and returned without him. He hasn't told us where he took him. Shota pointed towards the principal, who began to visibly sweat as Rumi and Dabi glared at him. I'll start searching the building, you two make sure these assholes don't escape before I get back. Rumi was uncharacteristically calm, but the rage in her eyes was evident. Dabi was silent as he walked to stand next to Shota, his eyes drifting between the two men who were now shaking in fear. Why are there so many pros here for Deku? One of the students asked, and Shota flinched when he heard the terrible nickname again. Dabi whipped his head around, a snarl escaping him as he turned towards the class and clenched his fists. My little brother's name is Izuku, not Deku. The hero spat, little licks of blue flame dancing off his fingers as he tried to calm himself down. Shota reached out and grabbed his nephew's wrist lightly, helping him to ground himself. Take your anger out on the adults in this situation, those are just kids. Shota spoke quietly, pulling Dabi back to watch over the two men. The students were still reacting to the fact that two pro-heroes had referred to the quirkless kid as a family member, and some were coming to the horrifying realization that there would be consequences for their actions. Tsukauchi texted him to let him know that a barrier was set up, and a group of officers was now searching the school floor by floor with Rumi's help. Shota asked the detective to have some type of notice sent out to the parents, so that they knew their children weren't in danger. Shota wanted to be out there helping with the search, but he knew he had to keep an eye on these two. He would not let these two escape the impending consequences, and he didn't trust that Dabi wouldn't cross a line if he were left alone with them. The kid was born to be a hero, but he had rage festering inside of him that could pop out in a moment's notice. It would probably be boiling at the surface until they found Izuku, and Shota knew he needed to support Dabi until they did. His phone began to ring again, and he saw it was Best Jeanist calling him. Jeanist? Are you on your way? Shota answered, not taking his eyes off the teacher as the man's eyes began to shift towards all the exits. I'm out front, where should I go? The hero seemed shaken by the day's turn of events. None of them expected Izuku to go missing, but they knew to be on guard just in case. Find Tsukauchi, he'll tell you where to go. Shota hung up once he got confirmation that Jeanist was finding the detective, and Dabi seemed to relax a bit now that another hero was there. Best Jeanist is here? A student exclaimed, and Shota chose to ignore the outburst. He couldn't forgive himself if he snapped at one of them, even though most of them deserved to be punished for what they did to his nephew. That would be for the courts and Nedzu to handle. Half an hour passed without any updates, with the officers and heroes combing each inch of the school in search of the kid. Most of the security cameras had been turned off, with the only hint of Izuku's location being the principal and his admin leading the boy into one of the staircases. It was so frustrating. The school wasn't that large, but it seemed like finding Izuku would be an impossible feat. Neither man would reveal where the boy was, whether out of fear or stubbornness. They were only making things worse for themselves, but Shota couldn't find any satisfaction in that fact until his nephew was safe. Eraserhead. His husband's voice called behind him, and his shoulders began to relax a bit. He turned to find Hizashi, Snipe, Nedzu, Nemuri, and Powerloader in the doorway. It seemed they had all driven together from UA, probably leaving their classes the moment they received the alert. Mike, did you all find Tsukauchi? Shota wanted so desperately to fall into his husband's arms, to lament over the fact that they still hadn't found any sign of Izuku in the building. He wanted to scream and punch and destroy everything in the room. But he had to stay strong, he had to stay professional as he and Hizashi played the roles of pros in an emergency. Yeah, he instructed us to help the students in the other classes get to their parents. The kids in this class will wait here until their parents can come up so that they can be interviewed by the police. Hizashi's eyes were bloodshot, like he had been crying on his way over. No one in the group looked okay, but they would do what needed to be done. I think Snipe and I will wait here, so that we can stay updated on what is going on. Nedzu smiled at the students before turning his gaze towards the two staff members, his beady eyes quickly analyzing him before he stepped further into the room. Nemuri walked over, her usually confident stride was dimmed a bit as she gripped Shota's wrist. We'll find him, okay? She whispered, and he could only nod as he watched her leave with Hizashi and Higuri. Do you think he's okay? Isamu said quietly, fidgeting with his belt as he stared out the window. Shota thought of Izuku, the kid who always beat the odds and stood strong in the face of any challenge set before him. He thought of the boy who cried in his brother's arms and believed he needed to earn their love. I think he's going to need all of us after this, but we're going to make sure he's all right. Shota knew Isamu had grown attached to the kid, maybe more than any of them had. Their relationship had always reminded him of the one he shared with Hitoshi, the type of bond you could only have with your dad. While Inko and Isamu had never made anything official, the man's place in Izuku's life was clear. He may not be able to see the gunslinger's eyes, but he knew they were probably tinged red with worry. We'll find Izuku, then we're going to wrap him up in some blankets and have an all-night movie marathon. Dabi spoke as he glared up at the ceiling, clearly trying to stop himself from crying. They all knew that Izuku used to idolize the #1 hero, and on especially bad days he liked to watch old reruns of the different cartoons and movies. We will kid. I'll deal with having to see that buffoon's face for a week if I have to. Shota tried to chuckle, but it came out as more of a wheeze, his body unable to even fake joy until he saw that Izuku was okay. They all stood there, itching to do something but forced to stand watch over the class and teachers. No updates came, and the principal was still stubbornly insisting that nothing had happened to the kid. Shota was tempted to let Dabi and Isamu do their worst, but then the gun hero's phone began to ring. Inko. Isamu answered quickly, his tone fond even with the dire situation. He nodded along for a few moments before giving her instructions on how to get to the classroom. Shota realized the woman was nearby, and he couldn't help the evil grin that formed on his face. These bastards had no idea what was coming for them, and he frankly couldn't wait to watch. How do you know Deku's mom? Bakugo asked, his eyes darting between all of the gathered heroes. Shota tensed at the nickname, but he realized the kid wasn't saying it with any malice. The blonde kept surprising him today, and he made a mental note to ask Izuku about it after all of this was over. We're his family. He answered simply, watching as the class shifted uncomfortably at the admission. How many of you would like to become heroes? Nedzu stepped forward, his hands behind his back as he surveyed the room. Every hand shot up into the air, the confident faces of hero hopefuls staring up at them even under the circumstances. Well, I hope you all have acted heroically. The investigation into this school will be quite thorough. I would hate for anything unsavory to come up. The rat bared his teeth in a wide smile as he watched the class twitch under his gaze, before turning back around. While the spectacle was a bit amusing, a text from Tsukauchi quickly turned their mood somber. They had searched every inch of the first 3 floors and had found nothing, leaving only 2 more floors to go. Shota wanted to wrap his hands around the principal's throat, but he restrained himself. He wanted to be a hero that Izuku could look up to. He wouldn't let this scum make him lose sight of that. After another half hour, Emi made her appearance in the classroom. Her colorful outfit contrasted her dark mood as she apologized for her delayed arrival. Tsukauchi said to check in with you all. Do you need any help getting information out of these two? She pointed her thumb at the 2 men in the front of the room, her eyes glinting as she looked them over. Her quirk may not seem like much of a threat, but Shota had watched her break some of the most powerful villains. Laughter could be just as painful as a punch, especially when you couldn't control yourself. Now you're threatening us? The teacher finally spoke up, his brows furrowed with anger as he glanced between Emi and the rest of the heroes. Clearly this is all an attention grab from the quirkless runt. He's probably hiding somewhere so that he can garner a bit of sympathy for his pathetic existence. The man's face was red, but he seemed to take his outburst as a chance to escape. He jumped towards one of the windows, but Snipe was in front of him before he could make it too far. The hero punched him across the face, sending him crumbling to the ground before they could even blink. He stood over the teacher, his presence threatening as he pulled the man up by the front of his shirt. Don't you dare talk about my boy like that. The normally cool-headed hero growled out, only letting go when Dabi pulled him away from the half-unconscious man. None of them felt particularly bad as Nedzu and Emi stuffed him into a chair, fastening his hands behind his back with handcuffs so that he couldn't escape again. I'm sorry you had to see that, kids. Isamu apologized, clearly embarrassed by his outburst. Most of the students were looking at the heroes in fear, finally understanding the situation for what it was. Bakugo was simply glancing between them all with confusion, like he was trying to piece together a particularly difficult puzzle. Shota knew that Izuku didn't like to reveal his connection to them all, but for none of his classmates to have any idea who he was related to? The boy was so hard-headed, believing that he needed to make it with his own talents versus his connections. He had to respect that dedication, but it broke his heart when he thought about how lonely the kid must be at school. A notification from the group chat informed them that Tensei would be there in about an hour, having just finished a villain fight in Hosu. His messages seemed a bit scrambled, so he asked Emi to give the young hero a call to calm him down and ease his guilt a bit. None of them could have ever predicted this situation, and all of them were doing the best they could to show up and do what was needed. I am hoping we will have found him by then, Nedzu said before baring his fangs at the principal. Shota was surprised the man was still being so stubborn, but hatred could cloud people's judgment. If the man truly believed that Izuku was subhuman, it would be difficult for him to see that what he did was wrong. He was still trying to justify his actions, but the arguments were falling on deaf ears. The door opened yet again, and the slow click-clack of heels preceded the entrance of Mrs. Midoriya herself. They could see the heartbreak in her eyes, but it was clear she was wearing her lawyer mask at the moment. He gave her a quick update on what they knew so far, making sure to highlight Bakuga's helpful tip when they first got there. Shota knew that Inko once saw the boy as her nephew, so he thought he should throw the kid a bone for his help. For just a moment her mask broke, revealing the face of a concerned and grateful mother. She looked over at the boy, who was currently staring intently at his desk with red ears. "Thank you, Katsuki." Inko's kind voice was enough to make the boy perk up in surprise, his eyes widening for a moment before he shut them tightly. Shota thought the kid was about to cry, but he quickly steeled his expression as he seemed to think over his response. They all knew she hadn't referred to him by his first name in years, not since his true treatment of Izuku had come to light. It was clear the gesture meant more to him than they would ever know. "You're welcome, Auntie," he finally replied, his voice quiet as he averted his gaze back to his desk. Shota couldn't help but think that this boy just needed some positive influences in his life, but he had other priorities at the moment. Inko smiled softly before shifting her expression back to neutrality, carefully walking over to where the principal and teacher were bound. "If you don't tell us where my child is, I promise you will be staring at the inside of a jail cell for the rest of your miserable lives." She leaned in close, her eerily cheerful smile unnerving everyone in the room. At that moment, Shota couldn't help but be reminded of Nedzu. Something about that thought rattled him, but he was happy the woman was on their side. The principal was about to speak, perhaps to throw another insult out, but the sound of scratching interrupted him. Everyone's attention turned to the giant windows lining the side of the room, where a single red feather was currently outlining a circle. It was joined by a group of them, all of them working together to quickly cut through the window at the front of the room before carrying away the extra glass. Moments later, a large figure flew into the room, and the dust cleared to reveal pro-hero Hawks to the students and staff. Keigo's jacket was wrapped around something in his arms, and a familiar head of curly green hair was sticking out from the side. Inko let out a sob of relief, and Shota felt his shoulders relax for the first time in hours. It seemed the kid was shaking in Keigo's arms, and the dark look on the hero's face made Shota sick with worry. Where had his nephew been this entire time? "Suku?" Dabi asked, his voice cracking as he approached his boyfriend and little brother. The jacket dropped a bit, revealing the boy's tear-stained face as he clutched onto Keigo desperately. "He was on the roof." Keigo finally spoke, his voice emotionless as he clutched Izuku tighter to his chest. He looked up, his eyes filled with a feral rage Shota had never seen from the normally chill hero. The energy shifted in the room, the pure anger radiating from the top 10 hero enough to send a chill down their spines. The realization that Izuku had been left on the roof by himself, for hours, began to overtake the group of heroes. Thankfully Nedzu had the mind to send Tsukauchi a text to call off the search, but the room was still tense as they waited for Keigo to calm down. Inko had tears pouring down her face as she tried to stand strong. Nedzu was flexing his claws as his tail wagged wildly behind him. Isamu had one hand clutching the front of his shirt, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to calm himself. Shota, well, he wanted to rip this place apart and throw every adult in this building into a jail cell. "They left my baby brother alone on the fucking roof." Keigo growled, his pupils dilating as his wings flapped behind him in agitation. His entire aura screamed danger, and Shota readied his capture weapon just in case. Emotions were high right now, and he didn't want anyone making decisions they might regret. Dabi was standing at his boyfriend, his own hands crackling with fire as he turned to the principal and teacher. "You are very lucky that I decided to be a hero," he said bluntly, letting the implication hang in the air. The two men began to squirm as Dabi's hands continued to glow with blue flame, but Shota stepped between his nephew and his targets. "Look at your brother." He spoke softly as he placed his hands on the young man's shoulders. Dabi's entire demeanor changed as he looked at Izuku's shaking form. "He needs you. He needs you now, and he'll definitely need you after this is over." Shota watched as his words sunk in, breathing out a sigh of relief when the fire disappeared and Dabi's eyes cleared a bit. He made his way over to Keigo and Izuku, who clearly didn't want to be too far apart at the moment. Izuku reached out a shaky hand and pulled Dabi close, and the trio wrapped themselves around each other tightly. Keigo had tears running down his face as his rage seemed to dissipate, his anger replaced by a broken expression that tore at Shota's heart. The sound of popping and the smell of caramel stole his attention, and he turned to find Bakugo with tears streaming down his face as his quirk seemed to activate on his own. He had the sudden urge to comfort the kid, but his efforts were interrupted by a particularly obtuse student. "Deku, stop being so dramatic. Maybe you could have done us all a favor and taken a swan dive off the roof while you were up there." The kid looked smug, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation as he sneered at Izuku's shivering form. The sound of popping ceased as Bakugo quietly stood and walked over to the other boy, grabbing him by the neck and raising his fist to strike. "Stop!" Izuku's hoarse voice rang out through the room, causing everyone to freeze in shock. He removed himself from the grasp of Keigo and Dabi, forcing himself to stand on his shaky legs as he stared at the floor. "Step away, Bakugo," he ordered, and the blonde wordlessly returned to his desk before stuffing his face into his hands. Izuku's eyes rose up from the ground, and he spared a glance at his teachers and peers before letting out a deep sigh. Shota couldn't help but think that no 12-year-old should ever have to sigh like that, the sigh of someone who had lived too hard of a life. "All I ever wanted was for you to not hate me. But I guess that was too much to ask for, huh?" Izuku asked as he chuckled dryly, before finally turning to acknowledge the heroes in the room. "Can I go home now?" He looked to his mom, who was wiping the tears from her eyes. "Of course you can, baby." She smiled, staying strong for her son as he walked back towards Keigo and Dabi. He reached out, easily climbing into their outstretched arms as the pair began walking him out of the room. Shota waited for Tsukauchi to return, and the detective and Nezu offered to stay behind to conduct the interviews needed for their case. He followed behind his family, watching as Isamu comforted Inko as they walked towards the entrance of the school. Izuku was clutching to his brothers tightly, and the two men seemed to have decided to put their anger aside in order to comfort the young boy. Hizashi and Tensei were waiting out front, and the rest of the family slowly trickled outside as they surrounded Izuku in a protective bubble. No one's eyes were dry when they found out where the boy was this entire time, and they all insisted on heading back to the Midoriya home. News crews had already shown up, hanging out just outside the police barricade as everyone piled into their cars. They all were angry, perhaps angrier than they had ever been, but they would save their anger for another time. For now, it was time to comfort the kid that had brought their family together. "The family? Hitoshi, guys? What is going on?" "Shota, Toshi will be swinging by to pick you up in a bit. Something happened at Izuku's school." "Mei, is he okay?" "Higuri, he is okay, little tinkerer. We just need to give him a lot of love right now." "Tenya, Tensei has told me what happened, my parents are bringing me over now." Izuku opened his eyes, his body sore from the position he was twisted into on the couch. He was laying on someone, probably Dabi if the soft scent of smoke was anything to go by. The last few hours were a blur, the feeling of being whisked off the rooftop the last thing he could remember clearly. Then there was the car ride home, only to be surrounded with quiet affection from his family. It seemed like everyone had arrived, and he hadn't had the mental fortitude to question his old friend's presence in the cuddle pile they had formed. His eyes stung from hours of sobbing, alone and abandoned on the cold roof of his school. He felt numb, but he could sense a toxic mixture of emotions bubbling under the surface of the wall he had put up around his mind. No one had expected him to speak, mostly talking around him or handing him food and water as they marathoned movies. He briefly registered the fact that Grandma Izuku had made him homemade katsudon for when he was hungry, and that Mr. Kobayashi had stopped by to deliver sweet treats. They had all mostly fallen asleep in the living room, finding comfort in each other as they processed their day. Tsukauchi came and went, giving them updates on arrests and sharing whatever information he could about the upcoming cases. He tried to close his eyes, desperately wanting to settle back into the comfort of his brother's chest and drift off into a dreamless sleep. His heartbeat rattled in his chest, and he began to feel suffocated in the warmth of the embrace. There was something fragile about him at that moment, and he couldn't stomach it. Not after everything that happened, after he had proved everyone right by being weak and helpless. What did Keigo think of him now? Instead of staying strong, he became a crying mess at the first sign of difficulty. All of his training, the years of work his family had put in, had been left behind as he shut down. His skin began to burn, every point of contact feeling like a jab as he wriggled out of Dabi's grasp and pushed himself away until he was on the floor. Everything felt too much, so he began crawling backwards until his back hit something hard. Voices surrounded him, but they were all distorted as he tried to control the panic overtaking him. Safe now. Like a shining light, one voice rang out among them all. He tried to focus on it, a lifeline in the sea of distortion that he was fighting his way out of. Izuku, we've got you. Another voice, one he briefly registered as Dabi. It's okay, sweetheart. This time it was Nemuri. We're here, we are right here. He was able to make out Rumi's ears through the film of tears in his eyes. We've got you now, sharpshooter. The smell of leather and gunpowder, and the cinnamon candy that Isamu kept hidden in his pockets. Izuku launched himself forward, nuzzling his face in the scent until he felt himself begin to calm down. Strong arms wrapped against him, clutching him like he was the most precious thing in the world. You're safe now, you're not alone anymore. Isamu whispered softly, the final pull that Izuku needed to escape the panic attack that had overtaken him. He let himself sob freely, the tight embrace making him feel free to express his emotions. He cried until he didn't have the energy to cry anymore, letting go of years of emotions that he had hidden away. Isamu lifted him up and carried him back to the couch, allowing him to have a bit of space and reacclimate himself to his surroundings. His eyes scanned the room, finding every single member of his family there watching him. Keigo watched him with sharp eyes, his feathers bristling with anxiety as his pupils darted across Izuku's body, like he was subconsciously checking for any injuries. Guilt flooded Izuku, and he couldn't help but wonder what type of pain he had caused everyone. I'm sorry. His voice felt like sandpaper as he spoke, but he wanted to make sure his message got across. Emi darted into the kitchen, and he heard the sound of a glass being filled as everyone processed what he said. What would you ever need to be sorry for, Izuku? Netsu spoke, but he didn't move forward. It seemed they all wanted to give Izuku space to process whatever he was feeling. I wasn't strong enough, I should have been able to get off the roof without panicking. He couldn't meet the eyes of his mentors, the people who had spent years training him for something like this. All my training was just a waste of your time. It was only a whisper, but the words reverberated through the room. Everyone stood frozen, unable to come to terms with just how much Izuku had held inside before this. Shota was the first to move, stepping forward slowly before falling to his knees in front of him. Kid, look at me. His uncle's voice cracked a bit at the end of the command, and when Izuku finally lifted his gaze he was shocked to find a few tears threatening to spill from the man's eyes. He watched as Sho pulled up one side of his shirt, showing off a rather large scar on the right side of his ribs. Izuku recalled the night the hero had gotten the scar, but wasn't sure why the man had chosen to show him it at this exact moment. Do you remember how I got this? Shota asked patiently, waiting for Izuku to nod his head. When the man didn't continue, Izuku recounted the story. You were fighting a villain with a mutation quirk, and then he threw you into a pile of pipes. He was still confused by the point of this, but he was grateful for the distraction from his situation. Yes, and I had to call in for backup. Was I weak for needing extra help? Shota's eyes never left his own as he processed what his uncle was saying. Izuku looked up, his eyes darting around the room as the dark voice in his mind told him that he would find someone that agreed with him. His uncle's reasoning couldn't be right, could it? Rumi stepped up, pulling her t-shirt sleeve up so that he could see a scar on the back of her arm. I got pinned under a pile of rubble, Birdie over there had to dig me out. Mike pulled off the choker he was wearing, pointing out a thin scar that covered the length of his throat. Someone tied wire around my throat when I first debuted as a hero. I wouldn't have survived if other heroes didn't step in to save me. Tensei was next, showing off a gnarly scar that covered his entire thigh. I got impaled. I wasn't able to use my quirk. If Manuel hadn't found me, I probably wouldn't be here right now. Isamu was next, showing off a collection of burned scars covering his lower torso. I got trapped in a burning building, but the water hose duo found me before it was too late. Someone got me by surprise and knocked me out. They probably would have killed me if it wasn't for your Uncle Sho. Emmy, with a head scar that was hidden by her bandana. All Might saved me from a villain with a particularly nasty electricity quirk. Genist, a bouquet of lightning bolts tricking up his right arm and neck. Got stuck underground, thought I was a goner before Gang Orca found me and dug me out. Higuri, who didn't receive a physical scar but would always remember his close call. Nedza stepped forward and slowly raised a finger to point out the scar on his eye. I had no hope in that laboratory, but I was given a second chance at life when I was rescued. Namuri pulled up the back of her shirt, showing off a collection of deep scars. A villain with a poison plant quirk got a hold of me. My quirk didn't work on her. Ectoplasm stepped in before it was too late for me. May stepped forward, her eyes filled with pain and hope as she stepped forward to show off a scar on her left hand. I wasn't paying attention in the lab, but you pulled me away before my hand got cut up too bad. Keigo, a scar that spanned across his chest. It was my last real mission for the commission, before Nedzu got me out of their grasp. Izuku had always suspected that the principal had a part in his brother's emancipation, but the confirmation just brought him closer to tears. When I first met you, I had a few misguided beliefs about the world. You made sure I learned that anyone is capable of being a hero. Tenya said as he lifted his chin, showing off a small scar from their first sparring match together. His mother came forward, sitting beside him as she showed him a long scar that ran down her left shoulder. When I was a young girl, a villain attacked the store I was buying candy from. I got thrown into a shelf and got this cut. His mother smiled as she told the story, and Izuku was surprised that he had never heard it before. Then a pro-hero came, and her smile made all of my fear and pain disappear. She's the reason I work so hard to make the world a better place for everyone. Inko kissed the top of his head, and he welcomed the affection. Hitoshi, who had been standing in the back of the room, nervously stepped forward. Izuku had so much he wanted to say, but he knew it wasn't time just yet. When Dad found me in that alley, I truly believed what everyone said about me. I believed I deserved everything they had done to me, that I was a villain. He ran a finger down one side of his face, tracing the scars he had received from being muzzled for most of his life. Then I realized I never deserved any of it, and you never deserved it either. Hitoshi held his gaze, but he turned before Izuku could say anything. Dabi was the last person to come forward, hesitating for a moment before sitting next to Izuku. He held his hands out, showing off the scar tissue that weaved its way up his arms and onto the top of his hands. You all know that my childhood was a bit rough. He paused, discomfort crossing his features as he took a deep breath. Izuku wanted to reach out and hug his brother, but he gave him the space he needed to continue. I was on a really bad path when you found me that day, and I don't like to think about who I would have become if you didn't show up when you did. Dabi looked up at the ceiling with his eyes closed, breathing through his nose before turning to his younger brother. We've all needed help in the past, Izuku. You're the first person to reach out when there is someone in need. Let us help you. Dabi's eyes were pleading, and his brother's request broke down the last bit of his resolve. He felt tears rolling down his face, but he couldn't process the fact that he was crying. Everything came crashing down on him at once, the years that he had spent silently suffering alone. The fact that he had pushed his friends away just to maintain the fabricated reality he had forced himself to maintain. Everyone was slowly inching closer to him, waiting for permission before they crowded him. He felt the need to explain himself, to throw his insecurities out and lay them bare for his family. They had been vulnerable with him, so he wanted to reciprocate the effort. I thought that if I couldn't handle it, I'd be weak. It felt like I would have wasted all of your efforts to train me to be the best hero I could be. Izuku couldn't meet their eyes, feeling ridiculous now that he had spoken his thoughts. Dabi carefully wrapped an arm around his shoulders, bringing him in for a side hug as everyone processed what he had told them. Shota was still kneeled in front of him, and the man placed a hand on his knee to get his attention. Izuku, there is nothing you could ever do to make us leave you, understood? His uncle's words were full of conviction, and Izuku let out a sob as he nodded his head. Rumi sat on his other side, wrapping both of her arms around him and hugging him tightly. You're only 12, kiddo. We're going to teach you to put less pressure on yourself. She nuzzled his hair, and he began to sob as her words settled in. His older siblings gripped him tightly, and the rest of the family came forward to shower him in loving words and affection. He had a long way to go, but he now understood that they would be there for him, no matter what. Nakaguro. Katsuki was having a very confusing week, his mind filled with a bundle of emotions that he wasn't quite sure how to process. It all centered around the nerd and the shocking revelations that had come out when Deku had gone missing. How did he know that many heroes? Not only did Deku know them, but they had all said they were family. Katsuki had known him his entire life, and knew that Auntie Inko and Deku's deadbeat dad didn't have any family. It was all too confusing, especially when he had been trying his best to figure out what was going on with the nerd before all of this went down. He wasn't sure what made him follow Deku home, or try to show him some kindness in his own fucked-up way. His childhood friend had friends, glasses and the hobo-looking fucker, and then that pink-haired girl that had joined them a while back. Katsuki wasn't stalking him or anything, he just happened to pass by the cafe on his way home and noticed they frequented the place. When he saw that the nerd wasn't meeting with his friends, he needed to figure out why. As much as he hated to admit it, he had viewed Deku as a kind of rival ever since he got his ass beaten a few years back. He wanted to see what the asshole could do at his full potential, and they both needed to get into UA for that to happen. When Deku started sulking around, it was Katsuki's duty as his rival to solve the issue so it didn't affect his chances of getting in. That all made sense. It's not like he really cared about Deku or anything. Katsuki, come down here for a minute. His mom called from downstairs. His parents had been a bit shocked when everything went down at Aldera, and they were disappointed when he explained his part in Deku's suffering over the years. They knew the two of them had grown apart, but they had let themselves believe it was just the natural progression of their former friendship. His parents had already started looking for a family therapist, as well as a therapist for him to go to on his own. He was forced to realize that his outlook on the world wasn't exactly healthy, but he wasn't sure what to do about it just yet. He descended the stairs, finding his parents in the living room with the television on. His eyes widened when he saw the headline, as well as the group of heroes gathered on the stage. Heroes band together after local middle school is shut down for child abuse. Katsuki wordlessly sat next to his mom, who reached out and grasped his hand. She had been trying to be better this past week, working on her own temper as she came to terms with her influence on his behavior. Principal Nedzu walked up a small set of stairs so that he could use the mic, and everything fell silent as he began to speak. Hello, everyone. The principal started, his small smile growing as he cast his eyes across the room. I want to start off by thanking you all for joining us for this historic announcement. Reporters stirred in their seats as the rat continued, clearly excited to hear what he had to say. Aldera's shutdown was big news, especially since so many top heroes were involved. Everyone was waiting to hear what would come of it and what the consequences were going to be for those involved. Regarding the shutdown of Aldera Middle School, we have arrested all of the staff members involved in the harassment and bullying, and most of them have been charged. The faces of the principal and teachers began flashing by. A range of charges including child abuse and quirk discrimination were listed under their names. Furthermore, all students from Aldera are to receive counseling and training regarding quirk discrimination and bullying. Those directly involved in the physical harm of a fellow student will receive black marks on their records, which will only be removed if they attend therapy and are cleared by a team of professionals. Katsuki's eyes widened as he realized what this meant, and he wondered how it would affect his ability to attend UA. For those that have wished to become heroes, there will be a long road ahead. But we are willing to work with the children to ensure they receive the help that they need. Nedzu's smile seemed genuine, and it was clear he actually cared about making the students better people all around. Sadly, the events at Aldra are not an isolated issue. These teachers and students did not wake up one day and decide to torment those they deemed less worthy. The principal paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. We as a society have to take accountability for our part in all of this, and we must rectify the mistakes we have been making. The crowd's attention was completely focused on the stage, and Katsuki and his parents held their breath as they waited for his next words. The heroes you see in front of you have decided to come together to fight quirk discrimination, and a number of our fellow pros have already signed up to help with this endeavor. The faces of Fat Gum, Ryukyu, Selkie, and other top pros began to appear behind the stage. The camera panned to show Fat Gum waving from the crowd. We will no longer stand by idly as people are assaulted and mocked for their quirk status, and we hope you all will join us on our crusade against discrimination. The crowd broke into cheers, the heroes on the stage clapping as they took in everyone's reactions. Katsuki's chest filled with a strange feeling. The only description he could give it was a sense of hope. The future was unsure, but he was willing to face it so that he could reach his dreams. Perhaps he and Deku would be able to stand side by side in that future now. From Mitsuki Bakugu. Mitsuki, hi. I know it has been a long time, and I take complete responsibility for that. I may be the last person you want to hear from at this point, but I just had to reach out. Mitsuki, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you are going through, and to know that Katsuki had a part in Izuku's bullying over the years. Masaru and I will be taking accountability for not teaching him better. Mitsuki, I get it if you never want to speak to me again. But I just wanted to apologize, Inko. Inko, oh Mitsuki, thank you so much for reaching out. I am happy that your family is taking steps to take accountability and grow. Inko, Nedzu put it best, this is a societal issue more than it is a personal one. I need a while to process everything, but why don't we plan a coffee in a few months to discuss how Bakugu Industries can help with our initiative? Smiley face. Hitoshi was still angry, no matter how much he tried to stuff away his feelings and lock them away. His therapist always told him that wasn't a healthy way to handle things. But what else was he supposed to do in this situation? He was angry at himself, of course. The minute he realized just how bad things had gotten at Aldra, he should have gone to his dad's or Auntie Inko, no matter how loyal he was to Izuku. He was also angry at Izuku, although that anger seemed misplaced after everything that happened. It was clear that no amount of support could really erase the pain and trauma that came with being born quirkless, no matter how much they all tried to pretend otherwise. No matter how much he tried to reason with himself, he was still filled with an undeniable rage that he couldn't quite get rid of. Hitoshi was in their home gym, his fists colliding with the bag in front of him until his knuckles began to ache. He knew he should take a break soon, but the rhythmic cycle of his hits were relaxing in a way he couldn't explain. The sound of the door opening barely registered to him, but a firm hand on his shoulder broke him out of his spell. You eat lunch yet, kid? His dad looked him over with concerned and tired eyes. Hitoshi wiped his face with his shirt and nodded his head, his stomach growling a moment later. His father chuckled before gesturing his head towards the door. Take a shower and meet me in the kitchen, I'll whip us something up. Hitoshi made his way to his room, rinsing off the evidence of his workout and sliding into a comfy pair of sweatpants and one of his dad's band t-shirts. The smell of simmering veggie made his mouth water as he walked down the stairs and made a place for himself at the counter. Hopefully my cooking doesn't poison us. His dad chuckled half-heartedly, but there was a bit of insecurity in his voice. The more extroverted and blonde member of their family had been working a bit of overtime at the radio station lately, all in an attempt to spread the word about their anti-discrimination platform. More heroes and volunteers were signing up every day, and a lot of their new recruits were due to the efforts of his dad. Hitoshi was proud, but it also left him and his father to deal with the things his dad normally took care of. Cooking was something they both struggled with, no matter how many times they tried to master it. Today's offering of rice and veggies didn't seem too bad, and he took an appreciative bite as he realized his dad had successfully made a decent meal. "Thanks, Pops. It's really good." Hitoshi stuffed another bite in his mouth for emphasis, and he didn't miss the small smile that his dad tried to hide underneath his capture weapon. They ate in silence for a few minutes, having always been able to enjoy each other's company without making small talk. His dad began shifting in his seat after a while, and Hitoshi realized the man had something to say. "You good, Dad?" Hitoshi had never seen the man like this before, and he wondered what his dad wanted to talk about. If someone in the family was injured, he would have told him immediately, right? "I can practically hear your mind working, kid. Everyone is okay." His dad gave him an encouraging smile, immediately easing his nerves. "Is there something else you wanted to talk about, then?" Hitoshi was curious, but he was still a bit concerned by his dad's behavior. "I know you and Izuku are still having a bit of a rough patch." His dad paused for a moment, his eyes drifting down to the table as he took a deep breath. Hitoshi shifted, the subject already making his skin itch as he thought about his estranged friend. "I think it's time I told you about my friend Oboro." Hitoshi listened as his father told him about a boy with a sunshine smile, who dreamed of opening an agency with his two best friends. He listened as he learned about how this boy gave his dad countless chances, even when he was being grumpy and saying that he didn't need any friends. His eyes filled with tears as he learned what his dads had lost, what was at stake with the career path they had chosen. Hitoshi jumped forward, wrapping his dad in a tight hug as the two of them quietly cried in each other's arms. It was clear why he had decided to tell his son this story, but it clearly hurt him to do so. They embraced each other until they both calmed down, and it seemed like a weight had been taken off his dad's shoulders. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Dad," he whispered, his voice vulnerable. They finished their food and cleaned up, and Hitoshi immediately got to work on the plan that had been brewing in his mind for the last half hour or so. He texted Tenya and Mei, confirming their availability before texting Rumi for permission to use her agency. Once everything was set in place, he pulled up Izuku's contact. "Hitoshi, meet me at Rumi's agency in 3 hours. Nakaguro. Izuku stepped into Rumi's agency, not sure what to expect after he had received a cryptic message from Hitoshi instructing him to go there. Their friendship wasn't fully healed yet, but Izuku hoped things were getting a bit better between them after everything that had happened after Aldera got shut down. The front desk person greeted him warmly before telling him that everyone was waiting for him in the training gym. As he rode up the elevator, he began to realize exactly what he was called here for, and he couldn't help but be excited by the prospect of a fight. It was a great way to work out your emotions with others, as long as the rules of sparring were respected. He was expecting Hitoshi, but was a bit surprised to find Tenya and Mei stretching in their workout clothes as well. "Hey guys," he greeted, still sensing a bit of tension in the room as he stepped towards the center mat. "Sup? Start stretching and let us know when you're ready." Hitoshi greeted coolly, going back to his own warm-up routine. Ready for what?" Izuku had an inkling already, but he wanted to confirm before he began strategizing. "We're going to fight you," Mei said as her eyes glittered mischievously. Tenya shot him an apologetic look, but even he looked excited for the match. Izuku shrugged and began working his way through his normal stretches, doing a few jumping jacks in between to get his heart pumping. He cleared his mind, trying to center himself before he faced his 3 friends. They were all formidable opponents, whether in a corkless spar or during a training exercise. There was little chance of him walking out of this with a victory, but this fight wasn't about winning. It was about repairing what was broken and moving forward while working their feelings out. "Ready when you guys are," he said as he stood up, already questioning his life choices as Mei and Hitoshi's faces morphed into matching feral grins. They all stood in the center of the room, readying themselves as they waited for Hitoshi to count them down. Izuku realized they hadn't set any rules, but his mind was too preoccupied to say anything. It seemed it really would be a 3-on-1 match, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. 3. Hitoshi said, crouching into a low position as he began his countdown. 2. Izuku eyed his opponents, recalling all of their strengths and weaknesses as he tried to formulate some type of plan. 1. Mei immediately leapt forward, clearly trying to trip him up and make him lose his balance. He jumped in the air, using Tenya's shoulders to vault himself into Hitoshi to knock the purple-haired boy to the ground. Rolled a few feet, both grasping onto each other tightly before Izuku slammed him into the ground. Before he could do anything to incapacitate his friend, a strong pair of hands were grasping his shoulders and throwing him into the air. Tenya seemed ultra-focused on the fight, already moving to kick Izuku as he fell to the ground. He only had a second before his friend's strong leg made impact with his stomach, so he did the first thing that came to his mind. He reached out and pressed his fingers under Tenya's kneecap, moving his fingers quickly to tickle the sensitive spot. The blue-haired boy gasped in shock, wiggling his way out of Izuku's grasp as they both fell to the ground. Izuku only had a moment to right himself before Mei was jumping on his back, using her body weight to push him to the ground. The girl sat on his back, and her strength surprised him as she continuously blocked all of his attempts to stand up. Hitoshi sat on his legs, further trapping him on the ground as he struggled to escape. Izuku couldn't see the pair on his back, but a cold shiver went down his spine when Hitoshi spoke from behind him. "Tenya, I think we should get some revenge for that cheap tickle trick he tried to pull. Right, Mei?" Hitoshi's voice was filled with a feral glee, and Izuku only had a moment to prepare himself before his friends were mercilessly tickling him on his sides and neck. He screeched, desperately flailing his body to try to escape the assault as Mei cackled maniacally. Tenya seemed to be holding back at first, but even he began giggling as he ruthlessly tickled Izuku's neck and underarms. Izuku wiggled until his arms were finally free, and he quickly reached out to pull Tenya's legs and made the boy fall to the ground. Sadly, his trajectory made him fall right on top of Izuku, Mei, and Hitoshi. The impact pushed all of the air from his lungs, leaving him a gasping mess as they all rolled off of one another. Mei groaned before flicking Tenya on his forehead. "Watch where you're going next time, glasses." She scolded, leading Hitoshi and Izuku to let out soft chuckles. Soon Mei and Tenya were laughing as well, and the group's laughter got louder and louder as they lost all control of themselves. It was as if the past few weeks had never happened. All of the tension melted away and left a group of kids being silly after a training session. They laughed until their sides hurt, trying and failing to get a hold of themselves as they relished in the normalcy of the moment. They would still need to talk about what happened, and Izuku would be sure to give them the apology they deserved. He was happy to enjoy the freedom of the moment until then. Nakaguro. Inko sat across from Nedzu, allowing herself to take a sip of his specialty blend tea as she looked over the documents in front of her. Their weekly chats had recently morphed into business meetings to discuss the Aldra case and their efforts to end quirk discrimination in their society. Inko was a bit disappointed that she couldn't be the lead attorney in the Aldra trials, but she was too close to it all. She and Nedzu had gathered the best attorneys in the country to represent Izuku and the other victims, all paid for by the various members of the family. The Bakugas had been extremely supportive so far, donating money and even offering to host a fundraiser event for their cause. Mitsuki had been so apologetic, it had truly moved Inko when they had met up. She was still wary, but she had seen the way Katsuki's eyes shined with concern for her baby boy back at the school. Everyone deserved another chance if they were willing to work for it, and she really did miss her old friend. Izuku had been doing better recently, especially after he and the other children fought out their issues and rekindled their old routines. She always worried about both of her sons, but Dabi seemed happy to support his younger brother as they worked through this difficult time. She smiled as she thought about her kind-hearted eldest son, of how far he had come since the day she invited him into her home years back. He had overcome his distrust of heroes and now was working his way to becoming a fully fledged pro. She and Nedzu had their suspicions on the identity of his birth family, but she refused to push him until he was ready to act. Opening up that type of trauma before he was ready to address it would do much more harm than good. Inko had just finished reading over Nemuri and Emi's proposal for a new community center near UA when Nedzu cleared his throat. She looked up expectantly, ready to hear whatever it was the principal had to say. "I apologize for interrupting your focus, but I think it's time we discussed Izuku's schooling moving forward." He pushed a packet her way, and she was unsurprised to find a detailed pros and cons list for each option he was presenting. Nedzu gave her a few minutes to look everything over, his characteristic smile gracing his face as he kept his paws folded in front of him. Every option had its own strengths and weaknesses, but she couldn't help but think that this was something Izuku should decide for himself. Her son's comfort was her top priority, especially when it came to his future school. I have my own opinions, but I think we should let Izuku look these over and decide on his own. She shut the file, sliding it into her bag so that she could pass it on to her youngest son later on. Agreed, although I already have an idea of what he will decide on. Nedzu filled his cup as he spoke, and Inko knew which option he had in mind. The principal had written up a mock schedule that would let Izuku attend both UA as his personal student and Sumai as an honor student. It would be a way for her son to get the best education possible while still being able to socialize with his friends and other children his age. Truthfully, it was the option that Inko herself preferred, but she didn't want to pressure Izuku when it came to this. He still had so much to work through, and she didn't want to hamper any progress he made by being too controlling. Although, she wouldn't hesitate to tear down any institution that harmed her baby ever again. They finished their tea, wrapping up a few more things regarding their anti-discrimination project and even getting in a few rounds of chess. Inko made her way home afterwards, looking forward to having a night in with her sons. Nakaguro. Present Mix Official Fan Club. Rumi, I forgot to send this after the kiddos had their battle to the death in my gym. Asterisk image of Izuku, Tenya, Hitoshi, and Mei laying in a pile in the middle of the floor. All of them are asleep. Asterisk. Namuri, they are so precious. Inko, thank you for the new screensaver. Rumi, smiley face. Mike, why are they so adorable? Shota, does anyone know where I could get this printed out for my desk? Nedzu, Shota, I will have multiple copies for each of us by tomorrow morning. Would you like yours on your desk? Shota, yes please. Isamu, I would like to request a copy as well, smiley face. Tensei, I love how they all fight their problems out. Should we be concerned? Dabi, nah, as long as they aren't hurting each other. Keigo, sparring is the best way to work out your feelings, outside of therapy I guess. Emmy, you guess? Genist, I am happy the children have worked their issues out, perhaps we can take them shopping to celebrate? Mike, as long as Hitoshi doesn't come home wearing a denim suit, that is fine with me. Genist, what is wrong with a denim suit? Higuri, in YWS. Nedzu, may I have a copy as? Nedzu, of course. Tsukauchi, so the kids fighting is normal? Rumi, you get used to it after a while. Hitoshi, if any of you show this picture to people outside of the family you are dead. Tenya, Hitoshi, I think it is a nice picture. It shows how much we trust each other. Izuku, Tenya, they will probably show it to our future teachers at UA. Tenya, oh no. May, I want you all to remember that I have a collection of embarrassing photos of all of you, and I am not afraid to use them, smiley face. Netsufu, what a great use of blackmail, May. Smiley face. Izuku straightened his tie as he looked in the mirror, furrowing his eyebrows when he saw that it was still a bit crooked. He didn't have time to redo it, so he decided that he would ask Tenya to fix it for him before school started. He grabbed his bag and made his way downstairs, his mind racing as he thought about what he had waiting for him today. It was his first day as a hybrid student of Sumai Academy and UA, a decision he had made with his mom and Nedzu after they had shown him his various options. They didn't seem surprised by his choice, quickly making the arrangements with both schools so that he could start classes as soon as possible. Based on the stories he had heard from his friends, the students and teachers of Sumai were kind and welcoming to everyone, regardless of quirk status. He reached the dining room, smiling when he saw Keigo and Dabi putting out place settings while joking around with each other. The two men looked up when he plopped his bag on a chair, their eyes immediately landing on his bunched-up tie. Need a hand with that tie, Squirt? Dabi asked, already moving forward to assist. Izuku blushed in embarrassment. He didn't think the tie looked that bad. Instead of voicing his thoughts, he simply nodded, standing still as his older brother fixed his tie for him. You know, I'd be happy to give you a few lessons on how to properly tie one of those. Isamu said as he walked out of the kitchen, his hands filled with plates of pancakes as he made his way towards the table. It wasn't uncommon to see various members of the family at their breakfast and dinner table, but the man had made sure to attend almost every meal they held. He was a constant presence in their lives, something Izuku appreciated more and more as time went on. "That'd be nice," he replied, but his hungry eyes were already surveying the spread in front of them. Isamu had been trying to get them to appreciate fine American dining, showing off the meals he learned to make during his 5-year stint in the States. Pancakes had quickly become a household favorite, especially when they could be packed with protein tailored for a house full of heroes and heroes in training. Izuku helped carry out the rest of the plates once he was done admiring the meal. He was about to take a seat when the front door opened, and he smiled brightly as his 3 friends came barreling through the door. "Like I said before, we can beat up anyone who tries to even look at Izuku wrong." Hitoshi was looking at Tenya as he spoke, and Izuku laughed at his friend's casual threats of violence. "You know I can just beat them up myself, right?" Izuku grinned as he went to greet them. He hadn't expected them to pick him up for school, but it was a welcome surprise. Things had gotten much better between them after their fight at Mirko's agency, but he still owed them a real apology for his behavior. "I do not believe that the faculty at Sumai would appreciate us fighting our fellow students," Tenya scolded, but he paused for a moment before pushing his glasses up his nose. "But there are certain circumstances where that might be necessary." The blue-haired boy had a mischievous grin as they all sat down at the table, and Izuku couldn't stop smiling as he ate breakfast with his friends and family. The front door opened again to reveal Rumi, still in her hero uniform after a night shift. Her nose twitched as she made her way to the dining room, her eyes lighting up when she saw the stacks of pancakes. "Mornings," she mumbled before grabbing a plate and stacking it with the delicious spheres. "Good morning, sweetheart. Would you like some coffee?" Izuku's mom asked, but she was already pouring his older sister a generous serving. Rumi nodded, humming as she ate her meal. Izuku went back to eating until a thought crossed his mind. "Rumi, weren't you planning on going back to your apartment after your shift today?" He was confused, especially as he watched his older sister struggling to keep her eyes open as she finished off her meal. Rumi quirked an eyebrow at him and sat up straight, stretching her arms over her head to wake herself up. "And miss my little brother's first day at his new school?" She ruffled his hair as she got up to wash her plate, and Izuku couldn't help but smile as he thought about her words. The rest of breakfast was spent listening as Tenya gave him a rundown of their teachers and classmates, with the added commentary of Hitoshi and Mei sprinkled in. All of his classes were with his friends, and he would spend his mornings and lunch at Sumai before heading to UA for the rest of his day. He was excited to go to school without having to worry about bullies or trying to prove himself to anyone. The children helped clean up all of the dishes once they were finished with their meals, and Rumi gave Izuku a bone-crushing hug and a grumbled, "Good luck," before passing out on the couch. "Good luck, little bird." Keigo ruffled his hair before pulling him into a hug and squeezing him. "If anyone gives you any problems, you know where to find us." The hero continued, his eyes glinting darkly as he made his way towards the door. It was clear his older brother had been struggling a bit since the incident at Aldera, but Dabi had insisted that he was helping his boyfriend through it. Izuku never wanted to overstep, but he also understood the dangers of trying to deal with these types of things on your own. He just hoped his brother knew that he had a support system. "Give them hell, Izuku." Dabi kissed the top of his head and gave him a thumbs up as he followed Keigo out the door. Izuku chuckled and rolled his eyes, letting his thoughts drift back to the day ahead of him. He shouldered his bag, making his way to the kitchen so that he could say goodbye to his mom and Isamu as well. His mother had wanted to drive him to school, but he had convinced her to let him ride the train with his friends. It would be fun to commute with his friends each day, something to look forward to in the mornings before they had to face the trials of academia. His ride to UA in the afternoon would be its own joy, a time for him to be by himself to decompress before whatever Nedzu had planned for him. "Have a great day, baby. I can't wait to hear all about it." His mom kissed his face all over, and he tried to hide his face behind his hands to rebuke the onslaught of affection. "Mom, that is so embarrassing," he whined while laughing. Hitoshi had his phone out, and his mischievous grin made it clear that he had captured the moment on his camera. "I was just trying to wish my baby boy good luck," but I guess you're too old for that now. Inko winked at him and gave his forehead one last kiss before picking up her cup of coffee and taking a sip. Good luck, sharpshooter. I'll meet you outside the shooting range when classes are over. Isamu pulled him in for a quick hug and gave him a strong pat on the back. The man had offered to give Izuku a ride home from UA, something he was grateful for. Izuku always enjoyed one-on-one time with Isamu, and he looked forward to telling him about his day later on. The kids said their last goodbyes and made their way to the train station, laughing and joking around as they enjoyed their new routine. Mei was telling Izuku about a new idea for Dabi's hero suit while Hitoshi and Tenya talked about a new video game that just came out. There was a lightness in the air, but something still sat heavily on Izuku's chest. It sat on his mind as they waited for the train, and its weight continued to press down on his mind as they rode to their stop. There was something he had to do before they made the first steps on this new journey together. The walk from the train station to Sumai Academy was short, but it gave Izuku enough time to think over his words as they approached the sprawling campus. It was a beautiful school, one Izuku couldn't wait to explore over the next 2 years with his friends. He stopped right outside the gate, stepping to the side so that other students could head in for the day. His friends noticed his pause, and they stood next to him with concerned faces as he gazed up at the school. Izuku, it's okay to be nervous, Hitoshi said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder as a sign of support. Izuku smiled at his friend and softly brushed his arm off. His nerves weren't important right now. Before we go inside, I have something I need to say. He made sure to look up as he spoke, to show he was serious about every word that left his mouth. What's going on? Tenya asked, his eyes filled with worry as he waited for the shorter boy to respond. Izuku took a deep breath, briefly going over what he wanted to say before he spoke again. I am deeply sorry for how I treated you all. You have been great friends to me and I pushed you away when you were only trying to help me. Izuku's fingers began playing with the hem of his blazer as his eyes began to dart around. I promise that I will come to you all whenever I am experiencing something like that, and I will never treat you that way again. He waited with bated breath, hoping that his intentions were clear. His friends had forgiven him with their actions, but he wanted to use his words to put this all behind him. 3 pairs of arms wrapped around him suddenly, crushing him in a tight group hug as his friends spoke over each other. We've already forgiven you, idiot, Mei exclaimed, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she stuffed her face into Izuku's chest. That was a very honorable apology, Izuku. Tenya tightened his hold as his glasses began to slip down his nose. I'll hold you to that promise. Hitoshi gave Izuku one last squeeze before letting go, giving him a genuine smile before gesturing to the front gate of the building. Now, I think it's time for you to start your first day at Sumai. Nakaguro. Izuku's first day at Sumai Academy could be described in many different ways, depending on how you looked at it. There was the chaos that came with sharing a classroom with his 3 best friends, especially when Mei insisted on telling everyone that they were business partners whenever she got the chance. There was the surprise he felt when his quirklessness was easily accepted. His fellow students were more interested in why he was transferring so late into the year than his quirk status. The joy he felt as he sat at a lunch table with his best friends, free to eat his meal and joke around without wondering if he would be attacked. Here he was not Deku, the quirkless freak who occasionally mumbled and was an easy target. He was Midoriya, a student with potential and friends that were by his side the entire day. His classmates were friendly, each of them coming up to introduce themselves and wish him luck at Sumai. Izuku briefly wondered if his friends had said anything threatening before his first day, but he decided he would let them have their fun if it meant the rest of the school year would be peaceful for him. The first part of the day had gone by quickly, the hours melting away until it was time for lunch and then his train ride to UA. His walk back to the station was relaxing, although people gave him strange looks as he passed by in his school uniform in the middle of the day. It probably looked like he was skipping, but he'd make sure to get some type of pass from Nedzu in case anyone asked too many questions. Although the route was a bit different, the journey to UA was a familiar one for him after so many years training at the school. He got off at his stop and made the trek to UA's campus, his mind wandering as he walked. Izuku couldn't help but wonder what the rest of his day would involve, but he knew Nedzu would have something exciting for him to do. He passed through the front gate, smiling as he saw students milling about campus as they walked to class or took a break on the lawn. Some of the students seemed intrigued by the middle schooler walking around their campus, but most of them quickly turned their attention back to their books or their friends. Izuku entered the main building, using a few secret routes to get to Nedzu's office quickly without running into too many people. He waved at the hidden cameras along his path, and the principal's door opened before he could even knock.
Shizuku, Kel.
Nedzu greeted from his desk, jumping up when he saw his personal student walk through the door. Izuku greeted his mentor and poured himself a cup of hot tea, breathing in the flowery aroma and immediately relaxing as he sat in one of the lounge chairs facing the desk. "How was your first day at Sumai?" Nedzu asked as he made himself a cup of tea. Izuku told the principal about his new teachers and classmates, emphasizing the kindness and respect that they had shown him. He was sure that his mom and Nedzu wouldn't hesitate to shut down another school if necessary, and he wanted to avoid that if possible. Nedzu went over a few things with him, including what they would be covering for the rest of the school year. He'd be working on his quirk analysis, viewing the hero classes and helping the teachers make adjustments to their training. There would be days where he would be in the support lab, working on his own projects and learning new skills. His mentor also wanted him to work on his language skills, sharpening his English and exploring other languages that would be useful to him. When they were finished discussing any projects Izuku wanted to work on over the next few months, Nedzu clapped his hands and jumped down from his desk chair. "As we discussed, I have someone I'd like for you to meet today." Nedzu made his way out of the room, and Izuku followed behind obediently. He was curious who he would be meeting, as he had met all of the staff of UA over the years through random holiday parties or his visits to UA. His family members were the ones he was closest to, of course, but he had gotten to know members of the staff like Ectoplasm and Lunch Rush fairly well. Recovery Girl had even helped heal him when he had a particularly nasty cold a year back. They walked through the halls, eventually ending up in a wing of the school that Izuku wasn't familiar with. There were mostly empty offices in this part of the school, places for visiting heroes or new staff members to set up their spaces. Nedzu approached a half-open door, carefully knocking to alert whoever was inside of their presence. "Come in." A gruff voice called out, and Izuku followed the principal into the office. Someone was bent over a box in the back corner of the room, and the entire space looked like it was still being put together. When the man stood up, Izuku immediately recognized him as the pro-hero Hound Dog. "Izuku, I'd like you to meet UA's new head of security and counseling." Nedzu gestured towards the hero, who nodded his head in acknowledgement. "It is nice to meet you officially, kid. I've heard a lot about you from the other staff." Hound Dog reached out and shook Izuku's hand, then gestured for him to sit. "Is this about starting therapy?" Izuku turned to Nedzu. He had promised to start going to therapy, but he didn't realize he would be starting his first day of school. "We won't be having a session today, if that's what you mean. This is just a way for us to get to know each other and see if I'm the right therapist for you and your needs," Hound Dog assured, his voice much softer than Izuku would expect from a hero with his reputation. Izuku took his seat hesitantly, but he began to relax a bit as his eyes drifted around the room. He trusted Nedzu, and it seemed that Nedzu trusted Hound Dog enough to be the school counselor. While he may be nervous, he would approach the situation with an open mind. "Izuku, meet me in my office when you two are finished." Nedzu patted his hair and made his way into the vents of the school, probably planning on scaring a few teachers on his way back. Hound Dog sat at his desk and sorted through a few things before looking up at Izuku. "So, Midoriya, do you have any questions for me about therapy? Or anything really?" The hero's eyes were soft and welcoming, much different than what someone would expect from the hunting dog hero. Izuku thought for a few moments, but he already knew the first question he would ask. It used to be a question he used to get affirmation, but now it was a way to gauge the heroes he met. "Hound Dog, do you think quirkless people can be heroes?" He asked the question plainly, but he held his breath as he waited for a response. The hero looked at him intensely for a few moments, but nodded his head in appreciation before speaking. "I think that anyone can become a hero with the right motivation and training, regardless of their quirk." Hound Dog replied, and Izuku couldn't detect any deception in his tone. "Also, you can just call me Inui, kid." The hero finished. "Thank you, Inui." Izuku smiled at the counselor. Perhaps therapy wouldn't be too bad, after all. Nakaguro. The weeks began to pass by as Izuku got settled into his new routine. His training was balanced with trips to the arcade with his friends and siblings, therapy sessions with Inui, and whatever trouble he and Mei could get into at the lab. He felt secure, more secure than he had ever been before. There were still moments where anger threatened to overtake him, but he was learning how to control it. Heroes continued to sign up to support their movement by volunteering their time and donating money. Izuku didn't miss the various donations the Bakugus had made, but he wasn't quite ready to face that just yet. "Izuku, are you ready?" His mom called from downstairs, and he looked himself over in the mirror one last time before leaving his room and walking down the stairs. The entire family was gathered for a picture, something Inko had insisted on after she realized they did not have a family portrait. Everyone had been instructed to come, including Grandma Hizuki and Mr. Kobayashi. Inko was sitting at the center of the couch with Isamu, Mr. Kobayashi and Grandma Hizuki flanking them on either side. Hitoshi, Tenya, and Mei were sitting on the floor in front of her. Izuku quickly joined them there before glancing at everyone else. Keigo and Dabi were sitting on one end of the couch, with Dabi's arm casually draped over his boyfriend's shoulders. Tensei and Rumi were at the other end, throwing taunts and kissy faces at the couple. Mike, Sho, Emi, and Nemuri were standing behind the couch chatting with Genist. Tsukauchi and Higuri stood next to them, listening quietly to the chaotic conversation. Nedzu seemed content standing on Shota's shoulder, sipping on his signature cup of tea. The photographer finished setting up, helping everyone get into position as she adjusted her camera. "All right, everyone. On the count of 3. She instructed cheerfully. Izuku and his friends wrapped their arms around each other and pulled themselves in close. All of their heads were smushed together as they smiled brightly. This family was his home, and he was ready to face the future with them. Nakaguro. Green Bean Protection Squad. Mama Inko, dinner will be ready in about an hour. Isamu cooked up something special to celebrate the end of the Aldra trials, smiley face. Uncle Sleepy, Aizawa, we will be there shortly. We wanted to pick up some dessert for everyone. Rat God, Nedzu, splendid. I brought over a delicious new tea blend that would pair perfectly with sweets. Mini Sleepy, Hitoshi Dad insisted on us getting a decorated cake. Uncle Loud, Mike, hey. Celebrations need a special cake to go along with them. Ronald McDonald, Ms. Joke, oh. I'm down for cake. Nem and I are on the train now, smiley face. NyQuil, midnight we brought some wine for the grown-ups and a few fancy non-alcoholic drinks for the kiddos. Future mad scientist, may no fair. I want some wine. Mole Man, Power Loader Nope. Mole Man, Power Loader also, will be there in about 20 minutes. Denim for life, Genist, I am walking up now. I picked up a few movies I thought we could watch later on. Carrot Lover, Mirko Isamu won't let me steal a taste of whatever he's making, sad face. But it smells so good. Yeehaw, Snipe, if you help set the table I will give you a small plate. Burbox. Rumi just launched herself over the couch. Emo bro, Dabi, I've never seen her move so fast in my life. Zoom Zoom. Tensei, you would think she was the one with the speed enhancement quirk. Zoom Zoom Jr. Tenya, we should help out whether we get a reward or not. Although I would not deny a taste of whatever Isamu is preparing. The man in the yellow hat. Tsukauchi, I'm finishing up some paperwork, but I will be on my way soon. Everyone at the station wanted me to say congratulations. Smiley face. Green Bean, Izuku, please thank them for all of their work gathering evidence towards the cases, smiley face. Green Bean, Izuku also. I don't say this nearly enough, but I love you all. Thank you for everything you've done for me. I hope I can continue making you proud.